This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking who attacked our country. Subliminal
against the United States.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
Tonight fell in a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
How do the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
People have so much to believe and have such a material motive to put me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts of their birth to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
These people are in very high positions here.
Oh, na, my brother dear, this thing it may not be. You'll take your good sword in your hand and you'll go away with me. With your dum-a-doo-dum-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. The first blow that Lord Forby struck, the sword ran in an L. The second blow that Forby struck, the great MacDonald fell. With your dum-a-doo-dum-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. There struck away the Highlandmen when they saw their leader fall. They carried him and buried him a long mile from Harlaw. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. When them that's left should steal a cheer for them that's gang a war, just tell them plain there's none to blame, they're sleeping at Harlaw. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee. With your dum-a-doo-and-a-dee and a dum-a-doo-dum-dee.
All right, we're back. And now we're going to pull back the curtain and talk about this period itself and let it rip. I think to start, I want to lay down a little HOTGAF, introduction from the book The Ruler of the Reading, The Life of Franklin B. Gowen by Marvin Schlegel. This is, I think, the only biography of Franklin Gowen, and it came out in 1947. And despite being old, it's pretty critical of Franklin Gowen, I would say, on a moral basis for his activities, though it's probably the most comprehensive source about his business career and the important role he played in the development of American capitalism after the Civil War. Okay, so I'll set the stage here. Chapter 2, The Coils of the Octopus. The Philadelphia to which Franklin B. Gowen returned as a young man of 31 was a far different city from the one he'd left more than 20 years before. There were still merchants on Dock Street, but manufacturers and bankers now symbolized Philadelphia. It had become one of the capitals of the new industrial empire, which had risen out of the Civil War. The city was growing out into the country. Mount Airy was no longer the residence of gentlemen farmers, but a fashionable suburban section. A mansion with an art gallery had been erected by one of the Gowen neighbors. Not to be outdone, James had built an architectural monstrosity 100 yards away from the old Miller homestead in what was supposed to be the Italian style. Plastered a ghastly yellow, Magnolia Villa rose 3 lofty stories into the sky, wearing its incredibly tall white porch as a skirt around it, with little balconies at the third-floor windows to pad out its bosom. 7 varieties of magnolias planted round about gave the home its name. Stubborn as the Gowen character, it still stands, haughtily ignoring the arrival of another century. There, crotchety old James, Gowen's father, his Irish Protestant father, was roaring at the servants every afternoon and frightening the grandchildren so that they would go blocks out of their way to avoid him. Local legends were clustering about him. Years after he was dead, The neighbors would still delight in recalling the time his barn caught fire, and he chased the fire company away with a rifle, swearing that he would rather let the barn burn than have the firemen on his property. Damn. When Frank came back to Philadelphia in 1867, the stone house in which he'd been born stood ready as a home for him and his family. Frank settled down as his father's neighbor and devoted himself to the responsibilities of his new position. The interests of the Reddings' young general counsel ranged farther than the technicalities of corporation law. Remembering his years as a businessman, he was studying the details of railroad management. As he rode into his office every morning on the steam cars, his mind must have turned over ideas for increasing the Reddings' prosperity. So, now a little about Schuylkill County and the economic development thereof, which of course is going to impact all the labor issues. Gowen knew well how its main line had expanded in the years he had spent in Pottsville until it now resembled a giant octopus sprawling over southeastern Pennsylvania. From its heart at Reading, it stretched one long arm south to Philadelphia, another east to Allentown, two west to Harrisburg and Columbia, and one north to Pottsville. From the Pottsville arm, a multi-fingered hand reached out to all the coal mines in that section, with one long finger running north and west to Herndon on the Susquehanna. Another branch left the Schuylkill River below Pottsville to go west to Dauphin and Rockville, just north of Harrisburg. The Reddings' great weakness, as well as its great strength, Gowen realized, was its reliance on anthracite traffic. Although it had gradually increased its proportion of other freight, it still received more than two-thirds of its income from anthracite. The Reddings' only connection with the profitable trade from the west was over the Pennsylvania, relations with which were always on a precarious basis. That road, at the moment, was sending some of its freight to New York, over the Reading from Harrisburg to Allentown, and thence over the Jersey Central, but it was soon to acquire its own route to New York. Until the Reading could secure a more friendly western connection, Gowen knew that it would have to continue to rely largely on its anthracite traffic. For that reason, he felt that his company should take some interest in the management of the coal trade. His own experience had shown him how unstable that trade could be. Although anthracite was the major source of fuel and power in the eastern U.S., not only for homes but also for factories and iron furnaces, production at times increased even more rapidly than demand and sent prices falling alarmingly. All the important deposits of anthracite in this hemisphere are contained in 484 square miles in eastern Pennsylvania. Geologists have divided these deposits into four fields. We kind of talked about this. You have Lackawanna in the north, Carbondale, north of Scranton, and then down through Hazleton, Luzerne County, Wilkes-Barre, and then in the south, Shenandoah to Shamokin, starting in northern Schuylkill County, cutting across to Columbia and Northumberland and Carbon County, etc. Kind of a tiny area. So, anyways, he says the development of transportation, however, had somewhat ignored geological lines. The opening of the Schuylkill Canal, followed by the Reading along the same route, had united most of the two southern fields into the Schuylkill region, shipping to Philadelphia. The Lehigh Canal and Lehigh Valley Railroad joined the Fishhead at Mock-Chunk, with the Hazleton area as the Lehigh field, shipping to either Philly or New York. Although these two lines also provided transportation for the area around Wilkes-Barre, that district was still considered part of the Wyoming Basin. The upper half of the Wyoming region also had its canal and railroad, the Delaware and Hudson Canal, and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, both of which shipped to New York. So, we mentioned this last time, there were differences between the North Anthracite region and the South owing to the kind of coal monopolies that developed. They say that, several important differences had developed between Schuylkill and Lehigh and Wyoming regions, as Gowen knew. One was the relation between mining and transportation. In the upper two fields, the transportation companies, the four of them, owned coal lands and operated their own mines. Three of the corporations, in fact, had built their transportation lines primarily to haul their own product to market, and the fourth, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, had just begun buying up land in self-defense, since the other three were expanding their holdings so rapidly in the post-war boom, it seemed there might soon be no independent contractors left to ship over the Lehigh. So they were dominated in the north by large corporations, which through their control of transportation had their smaller competitors at their mercy, but the Schuylkill region remained the haven of individual enterprise. since both the Reading and the canal had been chartered purely as common carriers and no large mining companies had developed there. To Gowen, this seemed an ideal situation for the Reading, since free competition among the operators would increase business for the railroad. Right. So Benjamin Bannon's dream, the small operator, free enterprise kind of approach to building a coal economy. And so let's see, Gowen's looking at all of this. So yeah, the Schuylkill coal had to compete harshly with these other regions, and it suffered from two big disadvantages. One, its notoriously bad quality was due partly to the geological formations in the Schuylkill region, but chiefly to the operators' carelessness in cleaning their product. The other was its roundabout route to New York, which was overcome in part by, quote, drawbacks or rebates on freight bills given by the Reading on coal consigned to New York or New England. But perhaps the chief handicap of the Schuylkill operators was the fact that they were too small and inefficient to compete successfully with their corporate rivals, although that idea had not yet entered Gowen's head. He did know, however, that they had had many disastrous seasons. A few years later, he was to remark, quote, "I practiced law for 7 years in the county of Schuylkill, and in all that time, and up to it, there were but 3 men who had ever retired from the business of mining coal with any money, and one of those died in an insane asylum, and the other had softening of the brain. The shock was too great to their systems." Damn, sucks. While this was a slight exaggeration of the facts, it did represent the general impression the Schuylkill operators had of their lot. During the last 2 years of the late war, the rising demand of military production had sent coal soaring temporarily to levels which brought fantastic profits. With the return of peace, however, prices crashed to ruinous depths, dragging wages down with them. Fitful strikes flared here and there in protest. Miners were laid off, and war veterans came home to swell the ranks of the unemployed. Those who were still at work resentfully tried to make both ends meet on their inadequate pay. Ranking grievances moved some men to lie in wait for tyrannical bosses with clubs or pistols. Frightened by the wave of crime, citizens of property held mass meetings to demand police protection. In the midst of these critical times, there appeared a man with an idea for restoring prosperity to the anthracite region. He was a 37-year-old Irishman named John Siney, who was living in St. Clair near Pottsville. And, we've talked about him, the great Union founder. Now, I guess he was at a strike in 1867 that convinced him the men needed an organization with a treasury if their strikes were to be successful. Now, he had some experience mining in England, right? And with, labor movements, basically, right? He came in contact with, Chartist kind of stuff, right?
I'm not sure myself. I don't recall if he was involved with Chartists in England. I did want to say, I think, in terms of what you're saying about the geology, I'm not sure if we mentioned this last time, but this kind of relates to what you were talking about in terms of Bannon's sort of conception of the whole enterprise and its relationship with the geologic landscape. There's that part in Sons of Molly Maguire that talks a little bit about this that maybe you remember. They had that great quote from the North American Review in 1838, which said, the Schuylkill region seems to have been marked by nature for individual enterprise.
Yeah.
Because I guess the thing was that for whatever reason, the coal was just really close to the surface.
Right. It was right there. The seams were bursting out of riverbeds and things like that. And so he said that actually it became kind of like this Wild West, get rich quick kind of zone.
It was like a curse for everyone else, but it was a blessing for the mine owners. He writes, this accident of geology had important economic and social consequences. The ease with which many entrepreneurs entered the mining industry in Schuylkill County ensured cutthroat competition by undercapitalized operators desperate to recoup their investment and pay off creditors. The historian Grace Palladino, who has examined West Branch labor unrest during the Civil War, argues that the costs of the competition included unsafe mines, habitual cash shortages, and declining working conditions. It was the mine workers and their families, she said, who shouldered the heaviest burdens of this anarchistic trade. In examining Schuylkill County's dismal mine safety record, the author Anthony F.C. Wallace also found that early investors in coal lands sought to maximize the return on those investments by maximizing coal production. Likewise, those who operated the mines were not especially interested in the safety of their employees or the mine itself, Wallace found. because efforts to improve safety meant more expenditures and less coal. Ain't nothing new. Yeah, but most members of the coal establishment, the mine operators and the landowners from whom they leased the mines, viewed the peculiar circumstances of the Schuylkill region as a blessing rather than a curse, using that exact language. The county's geology encouraged individual enterprise, and its exploiters viewed themselves as the bulwark of a Jeffersonian democracy based not on small farms, but on small businesses. In this view, of which Bannon was the prime spokesman, there was a harmony of interest between employer and employee, for one could not flourish without the other. The debate on the merits of incorporated coal companies versus individual businessmen came to a head when a Pennsylvania State Senate committee undertook an investigation of the anthracite trade in 1833. I mean, this might be a little bit worth reading too, but the entrepreneur's argument was summed up early in the committee's report, released in 1834. So long as the wealth, the enterprise, the intelligence, and the patriotism of our citizens cannot be concentrated in the few, but are equally distributed among the many, the equality of rights continues to form a fundamental principle of our government. It must remain their common heritage. It must remain as their common heritage, constituting a large portion of the present wealth of the state and her principal strength in after ages. Spokesmen for the individual operators warned the committee that corporations would have a dire effect on the coal industry, the region, and the Commonwealth. They said the corporations would glut the market, strive for monopoly, influence the votes of their large workforces, and transfer the profits of the region's mineral wealth to faraway and possibly foreign capitalists. The most dire warnings evoked,
I mean, not wrong, I would say, in a lot of ways, though they had their own problems, but also not necessarily self-serving, but largely correct.
I'll just read this last paragraph. The most dire warnings evoked images of a colony ruled by tyrants distant and arbitrary. The effect of incorporated companies upon the general prosperity of the country may be compared to the dominion of despotism and tyranny, usurping the rights and trampling upon the liberties of the people, wrote Volney Palmer, a Pottsville coal operator. As a population or community of slaves differs from that of freemen, so does a population or community growing up under such companies differ from that created by individual operators. Which is an interesting analogy in the Civil War context, and it also kind of evokes the anti-Irish panic, the same kind of rhetoric that we saw from some of those, screeds.
I think even maybe in that section, around the same time of these investigations, the 1830s, somebody, at one point it was even invoked by, I think, the small operators, that this kind of corporate system of the future, if it were allowed to develop, would be just as oppressive as the absentee landlords in England and in Ireland over the Irish tenants, and cause all the same deprivations, which I think he notes must have chilled any Irish person reading that at the time, that would probably not be good.
The important connection that explains the transfer of Molly Maguireism so seamlessly to different contexts. That quote is particularly, the operation of the incorporated coal companies with non-resident stockholders upon the improvement of the coal region is similar to that charged upon the Irish absentee landlord. They impoverish the country by expending the revenues drawn from it in distant places.
Yep.
So, exactly.
Yep. So you see that synchronicity kind of happening, and the Irish pretty much viscerally, kind of intuitively saw the similarity.
Exactly,
especially the later waves after 1848, the potato famine and everything. So, King Coal is coming, rationalization, the corporate, now it's the Civil War, and these things that they warned about, those were very selfish reasons, and they were basically the hustle bros of their day, and arguably contributed in some respects to the dangerousness of Schuylkill County mines, because it was so easy to kind of get to, and it was all about quick extraction, that they didn't give a fuck about any kind of safety regulations, where maybe, though not perfect at all, some of the larger operations where you had to have infrastructure and corporate backing to build these deeper mines, say up in Luzerne and Lackawanna counties, where you had these corporate monopolies were the only ones that could scare up the resources to do it. That in some cases that could be slightly less dangerous, but there's still some horrible disasters up there, like the Avondale fire. But anyways, so back to Gowen and what's tumbling around in his head at this period. Or actually, back to Siney first, We just introduced John Siney, who basically in 1868, he formed a number of St. Clair miners into the Workingmen's Benevolent Association, which is initially like a sickness and death, like insurance fund for members. But then an opportunity for this new organization to expand was soon provided. A new state law decreed that after July 1st, 1868, 8 hours should constitute a day's work. The miners thought this meant that their working day would be reduced from 10 hours to 8 without a cut in pay. But of course, when their employers refused to grant them an 8-hour day without a corresponding reduction in wages, the men began to grumble. The next Monday morning, the miners at several of the collieries around Ashland, north of the mountain, decided not to go to work until their interpretation of the law was accepted. Parading from mine to mine, they brought out their fellow workers until all of Schuylkill had joined the strike. Delegates were sent to the Lehigh and Wyoming regions to talk to the miners there. The operators looked on in satisfaction, relieved to see a general stoppage of production. A month of suspension raised the price of coal to more profitable levels, permitting the operators to grant a 10% increase in wages and ending the 8-hour strike. This demonstration of the value of united action made the miners enthusiastic over John Siney's new union. Even though organization had never before been tried in the anthracite field, virtually all the Schuylkill men joined the Workingmen's Benevolent Association before the strike was settled, and missionary work during the winter brought the Lehigh and most of the Wyoming men into the fold. By spring, the WBA was as powerful an organization as this country had ever seen, controlling more than 90% of the nation's production of anthracite. Then its general council took action, ordering all mining to stop on May 10, 1869. This was not primarily a strike for higher wages, but a suspension of production to keep the supply down to the demands of the market. The step had the unofficial approval of the operators, who had privately encouraged the growth of the union. Unable themselves to cooperate in controlling production, they hoped that the miners would be able to accomplish what they had failed to do. In return for this aid, they accepted the union's demand of a bonus as a reward for raising the price of coal. In Schuylkill and Lehigh, the new wage agreements incorporated the, quote, sliding scale, a pay system which remained in effect long after the union had been forgotten. In the Schuylkill field, wages were based on the price of coal at the shipping point, which was Port Carbon. When coal sold at $3 a ton there, the men received their base pay. For labor outside the mines, this was $11 a week, inside the mines, $12. Miners, who were the skilled laborers, received $14 a week when they worked by the day, which was seldom. Usually a miner worked on contract, which was so much for a wagon loaded with coal or for a cubic yard dug, the rates varying widely according to the difficulty of the work. From this pay was deducted the wages of his laborer and charges for powder and oil used. Under the influence of all these factors, miners' earnings ranged from $50 to nearly $200 a month at this time, although the average was probably around $100. There's, basically, the sliding scale thing is, kind of developed, and there's a little delay. The Upper Wyoming corporations, the Scranton companies as they're known. Yeah, there was often like disconnect between the northern and southern companies of like some of the workers in the north wouldn't go on strike when the south would. There were problems. So Gowen was following kind of all these interesting developments of like the price rising and falling as like labor like is basically, going on strike, et cetera, et cetera. So Gowen had been following these developments with interest, and he had now even more reason to be concerned. His brilliant talents had been making an impression on the Reading's president, Charles E. Smith, and Smith's failing health was causing him to lean heavily on the shoulders of his general counsel. On March 24th, 1869, Gowen wrote to a Pottsville friend, declining an invitation to accompany him to Europe. He says, he apprehends that a large amount of work will be thrown upon him this year and will require his presence here almost continuously, so he won't go on his fun European vacation because he is about, at age 33, a month later, President Smith told his board of managers that his health required him to take a long vacation. He recommended they should elect his able assistant, Franklin B. Gowen, to act as president during his absence. And they promptly chose him. Yeah, it does say it's funny that it's remarkable because half a century was to pass before corporation lawyers would be generally accepted as capable business executives. I guess that became a more common thing later on. So, in 1869, he becomes the president of the Reading Railroad at age 33, a young hotshot. And for the first year, he restricted himself to carrying out the company's established policies, though he watched with an uneasy eye the rise of the WBA in the coal regions. While he shared the views of his times in believing that management alone should have the power to determine wages and working conditions, and that dissatisfied laborers could find sufficient redress by seeking other employment, he was not primarily disturbed by the operators' willingness to deal with the union. He objected more to the fact that suspensions disrupted the railroad business by making the Reddings coal cars sit useless on the sidings one month and work overtime the next. Even though the Schuylkill region had been idle only 5 weeks in 1869, he foresaw that interruptions would be frequent as long as the union insisted on its power to control production. His most serious objection, however, was that the association was trying to keep coal up to $3 a ton at the mines. As he saw it, that price was 50 cents higher than necessary to give the operators a profit. If coal could be brought down to $2.50, more could be sold, and the Reading would have more to carry. In his mind, he was unwittingly formulating the policy that was to carry America to the highest standard of living the world had ever known. Lower prices, expanding markets, increased production, and more goods for everyone. No. Yep, that is the game plan. Yep. So Gowen permanently becomes president in 1870, and then at that point he felt justified in intervening in the wage dispute, which was developing. So yeah, when the price of coal dropped below $3 in December 1969, the Schuylkill operators had decided it was a poor rule which did not work both ways. They proposed to the WBA that the sliding scale should slide down as well as up. That is, the men should accept a 5% cut for each 25 cents anthracite fell below $3, with a maximum reduction of 20%, or a $2 minimum basis. When the union refused to accept this, the operators raised the minimum basis to $2.50 and announced they would pay on these terms after April 1st, 1870. The Schuylkill miners therefore struck, although the men in the other regions remained at work. After a month of idleness, the rumor spread that the Philadelphia Coal Company was planning to break the United Front by going back to work at the old rates, as it could do very easily since its collieries had lower production costs than most of its competitors. Since this step might have induced the other operators to surrender and thus have kept wages on the $3 a ton basis, Gowen called on the business manager of the company, who denied the report. Nonetheless, afterwards, Colonel Henry Cake, the company president, ordered mining resumed at the 1869 rates. His fellow operators promptly denounced him as a traitor and expelled him from their organization. Gowen, who was also angry at this betrayal, took more effective action. Having just signed a lease of the Schuylkill Canal, he now had complete control of transportation out of the region and was able to experiment with an idea for settling these annual strikes. He increased freight rates on both canal and railroad by 25%, announcing frankly that the advance would be given up on a general resumption of mining. This increase of 50 cents a ton was not high enough to be prohibitive, but it did serve to make the obstreperous colonel disgorge some of his ill-gotten profits and to hint gently to other operators that independence would not pay. 4 months of expensive idleness, however, was making them restless. One of the operators, a Welshman named Benjamin Thomas, came up from his Philadelphia home to confer with John Siney with a view to reaching some kind of a settlement. As a result of this conference, Thomas went back to Philadelphia to ask Gowen to act as mediator in the dispute. Realizing that capitulation was imminent, Gowen agreed to offer his services. Both sides promptly accepted this opportunity to end the wearisome dispute. So Gowen sits down and meets with the WBA. The union presents a proposal intended to increase wages, and they agree to accept a reduction if it falls below $3. Although this exposed the men to a possible 33% cut instead of the maximum 10% the operators had asked, the union leaders hoped that prices would remain high enough to enable them to gain by this proposal. Gowen warned that coal would not average more than $2.50 for the year, but promised to reduce freight rates and thus indirectly raise the price of coal at the mines. When he agreed to submit their plan to the operators, the WBA was enthusiastic. The next day, John Siney assured a meeting of the workingmen that the president of the railing railroad was now with them, and all they had to do was hold out to accomplish their object. The so-called Gowen Compromise did not receive the same approval from the operators, who seemed to believe with their employees that it meant higher wages. Declaring that Gowen had departed from his instructions, they rejected the proposal. When Thomas announced he was going to resume work anyways, the Board of Trade changed its mind, and on July 29th incorporated Gowen's offer into the first written contract ever drawn up between miners and operators in America. So yeah, it's kind of the first labor contract, I think, in American history, right there.
Really?
So then like the HOTGAF fucked up shit starts happening with Gowen. On the first payday, Gowen's popularity with the miners vanished. Instead of the increase they'd been expecting, they found their pay envelopes docked 8.25%. In 4 months, the cut had grown to 24.75%. John Siney asked the Board of Trade to reopen the wage question, but his request was summarily dismissed by the outraged operators. With a not altogether logical resentment, the men who had so enthusiastically accepted Gowen's proposal now denounced him for their plight. One of them declared, quote, "We were positively assured that if coal fell in the market when the compromise was made, that tolls, freight rates, were to correspond with the prices of coal and wages. But coal and wages are falling, while the prices of tolls are going up as rapidly as coal falls, all of which comes off the miners and laborers who produce the coal. This is not what we bargained for." Another miner put his feelings into an ironically humorous song, of which one verse ran, "And thinking that the scale would turn, the men did work along, expecting for the coming month to have 8.25 on. But when the 25th did come, it was the same old tale, to have 8.25 off, me boys, upon the sliding scale." No. He sent a copy of the poem to Gowen in his neatest handwriting and received in return a crisp new $10 bill, but no comment. Damn, that's fucked up. All right,
just
so
for the record, the first labor contract in American history was considerably earlier.
Okay.
Just
I'm not. I guess between miners and operators. For mining specifically.
For mining,
For mining.
Yeah.
So despite all of this, the WBA accepts a contract for the following year that's mostly the same. Gowen said it was satisfactory and promised to lower his tolls if the union would abandon its policy of suspensions. To this, Siney objected that something had to be done to maintain the price of coal and wages. When Gowen refused to agree, the point was left undecided. The proposed contract for 1871 was not popular with the working men. The Schuylkill laborers, whose base pay was lower than that of laborers in the Lehigh region, had been clamoring for a raise. The miners were also dissatisfied with the results of the Gowen Compromise. Nevertheless, they would have probably accepted Siney's prudent advice that they were not prepared for another strike if it had not been for developments in the northern fields. In November 1870, the Scranton companies, which were still paying the high wages from 1869, decided to reduce them by 30%. Their employees went on strike and appealed to the WBA for reinstatement. They offered to pay up their back dues and obey suspension orders if the union would take them in again and join the walkout. The General Council accepted the offer and put the suspension to a vote. The Lehigh miners supported it. The Schuylkill men were against the proposal, but overruled by the majority. So with coal selling for $2.17, the Schuylkill operators encouraged the shutdown by agreeing to pay the $2.50 basis for the time worked in January, provided that a general suspension took place. But, this involves suspension, so Gowen, who had made clear his views on suspensions at the meeting of the two committees, refused to accept the strike so submissively. When he received a letter from Siney notifying him of the suspension, he replied, pointing out, quote, "When the Schuylkill men had the long strike of last year, the working men of all other regions profited by it and kept at work at large wages, which their employers were enabled to pay in consequence of the suspension in Schuylkill. But now, when the other region suspends, instead of the men of Schuylkill obtaining any benefit from the large winter business that might be done, they are forced to stop also, so as to help those who injured them." This line of reasoning must have troubled Siney, since he knew that it was true, and he had opposed the suspension for that very reason. Of course, he also knew that if Schuylkill had refused to obey the orders of the General Council, the Union would soon disintegrate, but that argument would have been difficult to explain to an industrialist like Gowen. What most concerned the Reading president, however, was the fear that the strike would injure the coal trade. As a result, he predicted coal would start out at a good price for a month and then fall, bringing wages down with it. The initial high prices would cause manufacturers to contract for bituminous instead of anthracite and induce iron furnaces to blow out instead of continuing to work. Repeating his theory of increasing consumption by lower prices, he declared, "Steady work at moderate rates would, in less time, produce such an increased demand for coal as would furnish to all the regions plenty of employment at much better wages than it can ever be secured by a strike." Okay. So now we're into 1871. I think a good thing to jump up is the Senate investigations that kind of pop up because they're kind of a chief turning point in the Molly story in terms of his narrative development. So let's see. Yeah, in 1870. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh no, I was just saying in terms of, you mean like the development of the story?
Well, I think because the Senate investigations in 1871, where he first kind of trots out a kind of gentle theory. He doesn't name the Molly Maguires by name, but it's actually it's sort of a scene that is sort of worth capturing because it's it really shows how official government and media spectacles like Senate committee investigations and stuff like that can be sort of twisted by these clever industrialists into presenting their version of events and kind of win in the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
And he kind of hijacks the whole thing.
Seems like they had been doing that for a while. It's kind of crazy how, we were talking about Bannon and what a perfidious person he was, but really he tried to prevent, he kind of stood for the small business owners against the hyper capitalization that you would see under Franklin Gowen later on. It seems like a lot of people kind of saw which way the wind was blowing in that respect. But it seemed like even then in Bannon's time as well, the government, for whatever reason, was very solicitous of, hyper capitalist corporations rather than
exactly.
Anyone else, or their employees of those corporations themselves,
Totally. So I think he first ends up, that whole state Senate investigation kind of first starts when I think there's a little more tension with the owner operator groups who he tries to bring in I think he brings them to Philadelphia in 1871 to lay before them his plans for forming a united front against the WBA. And they there was some dissension about ending the policy of work suspensions, but they were definitely not as tolerant of the WBA as they had been at first. The one operator complained about the WBA, quote, "They demanded the discharge of men who did not belong to the union. If refused, the colliery stopped. They demanded that no union man should be discharged. If refused, the colliery stopped. They vote that their superintendents are obnoxious, demand their expulsion, and if not discharged, a long suspension strike takes place. There are instances of personal violence to owners of collieries by members of the union in which the offending members were discharged and criminal process issued against them when the injured owners were compelled to take again in their employ the men who assaulted them with a formal written notice signed by the president or secretary of the branch that unless it is done, there can be no work at the colliery." Disgruntled at these interferences with the prerogatives of management, the operators lent a willing ear to Gowen's proposals to curtail the union's power. One of them may have asked what he intended to do about traitors like Colonel Cake, for he announced that if any operator started work on the WBA's terms, he would raise his freight rates. With this assurance of Gowen's solid support, they agreed to send a representative along with him to New York to attend a conference of all the coal-carrying companies. So going down here, so there was more wage cuts proposed and more conflict. I believe that, at this point, I think this is when Gowen makes a huge move where he massively jacks up the freight rates. Yeah, this is what, So they go to this meeting of coal operators and Gowen shows off his new schedule of freight rates, which were to remain in effect until the miners accepted the offer, which the committee would make.
100%. Yeah.
Yes, he said it did not call for any piddling 25% increase. This time, to make the rates really prohibitive, he raised the charge for transporting a ton of coal to Philadelphia to $4 a ton, double what it had been before. A few weeks later, he added another $2 to the rates, making the freight twice the value of the coal. The other coal carriers did likewise. Only the Northern Central, controlled by the Pennsylvania, remained superciliously aloof from the combination. And then I think then the union tries to go to the Board of Trade, the operators kind of combine, and then they say we don't even want to deal with you. They won't even negotiate.
And when he raised the rates, they took it to the state Senate, and there's a great Gowen quote during that time.
The speech, right?
Well, I was just gonna quote this short part where he kind of insinuated that of course the state Senate, we talked about, they were, for whatever reason, well, I mean, one people can put it together, but they were heavily partial to Gowen and to corporations in general. Yeah. And so Gowen was easily able to turn the hearings around and deflect everything having to do with his predatory rate increase and make it about the unions. And he said that they were connected to, in his words, an association with which votes in secret at night that men's lives shall be taken and that they shall be shot before their wives in cold blood.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So his they're kind of shocked when they get sat down for this. The way he describes it is funny. When the investigation opened at Harrisburg on March 8th, Gowen succeeded in persuading the committee to go beyond the point of law, which it was supposed to examine, and to take up the entire background of the strike. As the first witness called, he seized the spotlight so completely that the public almost forgot that other corporations than the Reading were being investigated. Dismissing the legal question under examination in a single sentence, he declared that the Reading had under its charter the right to charge whatever rates it pleased. With a straight face, he told the committee that his reason for increasing his charges had been merely to increase his revenue, thus neatly disposing of the possible allegation that his action had been in restraint of trade. Neither had there been any conspiracy. He had merely told his fellow railroad presidents what he was going to do, and they had decided to do the same. He then became prosecuting attorney and indicted the WBA for preventing men from working, for forcing the poor to pay high prices for coal, for violating its word, and for ruining the iron industry. He mentioned the recent murders of 2 strikebreakers, deftly giving the impression, in that quote you read, that the union was involved, but avoiding a direct accusation. By the time Gowen had finished, the WBA was so busy defending itself that it never had an opportunity to attack him. So skillfully was the investigation diverted that the Harrisburg State Journal snorted that the committee would probably find, quote, that the ill-used railroad simply acted in self-defense against the outrageous demands of the audacious miners for wages upon which they and their families can live. Wow. Simply a succession of witnesses, coal operators, iron manufacturers, railroad heads, and labor leaders gave the investigators a full account of the coal industry, but left them hopelessly confused as to the rights and wrongs of the dispute. In a preliminary report, the committee ignored all testimony it had heard and wandered down through the mazes of history of capital and labor, reaching the current strike only in the last paragraph when it recommended that the dispute should be settled by arbitration. Yeah, Gowen's eloquent speech held his audience spellbound. The investigators were so impressed that they added his address as an appendix to their official report. Like the clever lawyer he was, he made out an excellent case for himself. He declared that he spoke on behalf of the railroad and mining interests of the state, quote, which have been stricken down by the unlawful combination of an ignorant faction and are now struggling to be heard in a calm judicial investigation against the wild clamor of the demagogue and the fanatic. Wow. Gowen had attacked the WBA's policies of suspensions to maintain prices and asserted it was ruinous to both operators and railroads, without, of course, mentioning that many operators were secretly in sympathy with the policy. And, he says, calling attention to a gold-headed cane carried by one of the labor representatives, he remarked satirically, "Why, gentlemen, when I looked at these witnesses and compared their dress with my own, I really felt somewhat ashamed of myself. And if I had a better suit, I would have appeared in it, out of deference to yourselves and regard for the reputation of my clients." Damn. That's funny. It's like classic, like a Teamsters leader wearing a Rolex watch or something, and this guy's a grifter. Yeah, anyways. So, yeah, it pretty much, he just, wins outright in this whole scuffle, in this investigative committee. So, the union realized that they pretty much, the miners conceded to Governor Geary after this that the WBA would give up its policy of suspensions, the point on which Gowen was most insistent. And let's see, there was next finding, there was more strikes in Scranton. Governor Geary issued a proclamation striking at both sides of the dispute. He declared it unlawful to prevent laborers from working, to hold riotous assemblies, and to charge prohibitory freight rates. The militia were sent to preserve order in Scranton, and the Attorney General was directed to file suit against the Reading for the surrender of its charter. Neither of these moves served any useful purpose. There was no need of troops to suppress the miners, and Gowen was too sure of his legal ground to be alarmed about the suit, even if it had ever been pressed. They furnished a dramatic finale to the strike, however, as far as the general public was concerned, since interest in the controversy was waning. The return of warm weather had averted any danger that homes might go cold, and bituminous coal had replaced anthracite in industrial operations, just as Gowen had warned. So, going down, Gowen's wage committee, I tried to bypass the WBA after this by making a direct offer to the men on the basis of fixed wages, about 8% less than their 1869 wages. It added suavely, "We wish you distinctly to understand that we do not desire to interfere with your association in any manner whatsoever. We shall at all times be willing to assist you in maintaining your association for the relief of those members who, by accident or sickness, may require your aid." The WBA declared this proposal, quote, "is a trap, a snare, and a delusion, and bears on its face the impress of the mind of that wily schemer, F.B. Gowen." While the operators promised they would give the men steady work throughout the year at fixed wage rates, the miners suspected that their good intentions would hold only so long as the price of coal remained high. Nevertheless, the WBA leaders agreed to accept arbitration on wages, fearful that the operators' offer might seem attractive to many of the union men. So they finally come to a settlement, which is not great. I think they set the new minimum at $2.25, but this concession won by the miners proved meaningless since coal did not fall below $2.25 that year. He says the union had been seriously weakened by the strike. By forcing the WBA to abandon its control of production, Gowen had destroyed its value to the operators. He had also demonstrated to the colliery owners that the supply of coal could be restricted by the railroads as easily as by the union. In the midst of the strike, the Shenandoah Herald had reported a plan for the railroads to control production by limiting the number of cars allotted to each colliery, a proposal which seemed to have sprouted from Gowen's fertile mind. There was at least the germ of an idea which might be developed in the future. So that's what's going on in the early 1870s. Now, it's also interesting to note that, because like Making Sense of Molly Maguire, Sons of Molly Maguire definitely point this out, that during this whole period, Gowen's rise to like take control over the entire coal economy of Schuylkill, there's really like not, there's strikes and stuff, but there's not Molly violence during this period, right?
Not really, yeah. A lot of it happened like before, like during like around the Civil War and like resistance to the draft, kind of like we talked about.
Right.
And it really, like the 1870s we're talking about now, that was like the time when like the Molly Maguires, if this was like really an organization, but like this pattern of violence basically was like stamped out. Yeah, like it was basically stamped out. This is like the time of like the twilight of the whole phenomenon.
Yeah, and honestly, from Sons of Molly Maguire, you get the sense that a lot of the young kind of neo-ribbon men, kind of immigrants that had moved into this region and were in places like Cass Township and were involved in a lot of that Civil War shit and even stuff maybe a little before it, they were getting a little older now, and they were actually some of them were sort of maturing into like local political figures who were also involved in sort of supporting the union efforts and things like that. You know, you think about like John Kehoe is a big example, but also like Muff Lawler, Michael Muff Lawler, and a couple other guys like that who become tavern owners, become body masters of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and also get very involved in kind of local democratic machine politics, right? Like they're moving into a kind of a more political arena than and putting aside the actual violent tactics of like the earlier period, because there's a new organization that offers, perhaps a more effective way to reconcile, to win rights for the workers and everything like that, right?
Yeah, there's actually a good part of Sons of Molly Maguire that talks about this, and it sort of sets the clash between Siney and the Union and Gowen and the Anthracite Board of Trade, like against the clash between the culture of the Mollys, the old Gaelic peasant culture, and the emerging working class ethos, basically, like you said. But yeah, it's a good part. It's like a subsection of this chapter. It's called Culture Clash on the West Branch. And he writes, in a sense, the culture clash between those trying to recreate the Irish peasant way of life and those trying to assimilate had always played out in Cass Township. That conflict provided the context for the slaying of James Bergen, we talked about, whose repeated enlistments in the military betrayed an unmistakable urge to assimilate. The difference after 1867 was that those who wanted to leave behind the old ways gained the upper hand. A curious calm descended on the West Branch that year as the echoing footfalls of Little Hale's fleeing killers faded into the hills around Glen Carbon. We didn't talk about that murder, but you can get the idea. He was at the end of a long line of men to be killed there by a small band of Irish gunmen in the classic white boy style. To understand why the West Branch assassinations ended, and why the Cosgrove family wanted no part of any new ones, consider an anecdote about Riley Township, where they lived, that was related in 1957 by Harry Murphy, an 80-year-old former official of the United Mine Workers. It concerns a young man who turned his back on the Mollies and the Gaelic culture of which they were part and parcel. Me father told me about this. He went to a dance one night near Branchdale. Women and men in working clothes were dancing to Irish tunes played by an old Irish fiddler. The other dancers were talking Irish, which me father couldn't understand. The fiddler was a friend of me father's, and he called him outside and said, "They're all Mollies having this dance." And the two of them, my father and the fiddler, they dusted out of the place. Yeah, so
presumably that means fighting. They were
no, I guess they ran away. I think
they dusted out of the place.
I think I think that's what they. I think so. Yeah, like they didn't want anything to do with it. You know, they were turning their back on it. All over the West Branch, young men were turning their back on the Molly Maguires and the peasant mindset and lifestyle that produced them. In part, this was because many Mollies had turned their back on the West Branch, fleeing wartime military occupation, relentless post-war purges of Union militants, and unemployment. Their departure and the subsequent arrival of the WBA opened new cultural horizons for young second-generation Irish Americans whose perspectives were no longer limited by the dark, lowering clouds of Irish history. Their language was English, not Irish. Their music was the regiment of a band, not a free-willing fiddle. Their hero was not a mythical Irish woman, but a very real neighbor, John Welsh, a Civil War veteran who had taken a leading role in the Union, which saw as one of its prime responsibilities the elevation of miners' intellectual life. And it talks about the Forestville Literary Society, which is kind of interesting. You know, this is a sort of linchpin of working class culture at the time. You know, I think we can, skip over the main paragraphs about it. But it says, before it collapsed in 1876, after the Union was crushed, the Literary Society embodied all the lofty ideals of the WBA, featuring readings, poetry, dialogues, and debate. Many members were mine laborers who had observed the labor tumult of the Civil War from their perches in the towering coal breakers, where boys as young as 10 separated anthracite from slag. The labor orientation of the Literary Society is clear in such debates as, resolved, that suspension, a strike, is a benefit. That topic speaks volumes about conditions in the mines, but another shows that these young men had their sights on horizons more distant than the next coal breast. Resolve that the professions offer a better opening to a young man than mercantile or mechanical pursuits. The Literary Society was a part of a larger working-class cultural renaissance. A Forestville music group was formed around the same time by members of the same families, including Jim Lynch and Terence O'Connor's brother James. With band practices and formal rules of debate, the young mine workers were imposing on themselves a degree of regimentation that mimicked the discipline of the Union and was utterly at odds with the informal gatherings and barroom debates that had long been the rule on the West Branch. As I read this, you can really see, I almost can see like the 4-season like Molly Maguire TV series, like you like to see, these sort of changes happening over time. It's interesting.
You can have a lot of good chamber drama around this kind of stuff.
It would be interesting to see. I mean, or you could also do it like in the form of a novel or anything. But it's interesting, in the sort of climate of these sort of meeting houses, things like that changes over time. I remember when we were writing this script, a big challenge of doing it was not to be constantly going back to our script, but that's kind of part of how I relate to the story is through that experience. But part of it was always, trying to like capture like the vibe and like capture the, the mise en scène of the bars and stuff like that,
Totally.
And it's interesting to imagine like how that would be transforming, during this time and how those sort of hubs of Molly Maguireism would, be like passing away in those circumstances.
Right. Yeah. Like it shows you there's so much richness going on in even in quite young American history, and so much like churn and like transformation going on, especially in these periods where people are like struggling to like find their economic place and like define a kind of identity, or like how can they sort of like reconcile themselves with this new sort of like culture and like nation they've gone into. I think there's a good part. There's a little part I want to read here, just from Sons of Molly Maguire, about Siney and kind of like his inspirational influence on a whole generation. It kind of ties into what you just read. You know, it mentions the kind of laws that were the 8-hour workday laws in the 1860s, et cetera. And there was a mine safety bill in 1869 that was passed in April 1869, which was he says the first test of strength for the Union. They successfully passed for this bill, but in sort of as it moved through the committees, it only applied to Schuylkill County. And I guess or the reason why is, he says, in the Senate, which had killed a similar bill just 3 years before, Union-supported attempts to broaden the legislation to cover all coal mines had been killed by Samuel G. Turner, a coal dealer from Luzerne County. He hadn't even bothered to read the legislation, but felt comfortable talking about why it wasn't needed in Luzerne. Quote, I can now remember but one instance where fire-damp explosions resulted in injury to miners in the county, said Turner, referring to combustible mine gases. Less than 5 months later, he had reason to regret those words. On September 5th, the greatest mine disaster in American history until then killed more than 100 workers in the Steuben shaft of the Nanticoke Coal Company in Avondale, Luzerne County. A coroner's jury found that sparks from a furnace at the bottom of the shaft had set fire to wooden brattices above it, but that didn't stop mine officials from spreading the word that Irish arsonists were to blame. The mine had just reopened after a strike. So that's another early instance of saying the Mollies did it, right? As a conspiracy. Siney appeared on the scene and made a speech that seared the souls of many who heard it, including a young Irish-American named Terence Vincent Powderly. Quote, you can do nothing to win these dead back to life, Siney told the crowd, but you can help me to win fair treatment and justice for living men who risk life and health in their daily toil. Powderly went on to lead the Knights of Labor, but he never forgot the charred bodies of the miners being pulled from the pits, the mother he saw kneeling in silent grief over the body of her boy, or Siney, quote, standing on the desolate hillside at Avondale, daring to talk about justice in the realm of King Coal. Quote, when I listened to John Siney, I could see Christ in his face and hear a new Sermon on the Mount, Powderly recalled. I thereby resolved to do my part, humble though it might be, to improve the condition of those who worked for a living. Yeah, Powderly was not the only overnight convert. Senator Turner suddenly saw the light and championed a mine safety law, but his political career was as dead as the men of Avondale. The miners turned their back on him in the next election, and Turner, a Democrat, lost. In the post-war era, he was only one of several Democrats who were more than willing to do the bidding of the coal companies. Also, fun fact there, Terence Powderly, the founder of the Knights of Labor, which would go on more in the 1880s to have significance, was born in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, where my grandmother's family was from. So... Also, it's funny, given the story I told last time about, like, my great-great-great-grandfather, like, dying in a mine in Luzerne County, that this guy is, like, literally, I can only think of one incident where, like, people died in, like, an explosion.
Yeah.
Like, apparently this is so fucking common.
Yeah.
But, yeah, classic, coal owner is just in the state Senate, like, shooting down laws to regulate himself. Real, Doge 1.0 vibes in the state Senate, and... the other big thing that it kind of happens after this that is an ominous development is the entire intrigue around the Laurel Run Improvement Company that starts, I think, in later 1871. After his great performance, in the state Senate, he realizes, Gowen does, that the state Senate is very useful potentially to him. And he decides by 1871 that, like, the strategy of the Reading Railroad ought to be to own all of the coal lands that situate upon its railroad lines, basically. Establish a coal monopoly to buttress a transportation monopoly, which was being threatened by competitors. Now, there's one problem, though, because unlike some of the companies in the North, which were chartered as coal companies and then built railroads, the Reading Railroad was chartered as a railroad. It did not have a charter to own coal by law. Like, its corporate charter did not allow that. So what to do, right? What to do? Well, he comes up with an idea. Going back to the ruler of the Reading here, they say there was one major obstacle in his path. The Scranton companies and the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company had been granted the right to own and operate coal mines by their charters. The Reading alone of the 6 anthracite corporations was denied the privilege of owning coal lands. Although an act of the Assembly in 1869 had granted to any railroad or canal company the right to buy stock in any coal or iron company, Gowen had lobbied through an amendment excluding Schuylkill County from the provisions of the act. He now probably had some reason to regret this amendment, but he felt sure of his ability to persuade the Pennsylvania legislature to permit him to buy coal lands. Pending this permission, he introduced persons interested in the Reading to begin purchases on the promise that the company would take the properties off their hands at cost plus 6% interest as soon as the necessary legislation was obtained. Some lands he bought in his own name with money furnished by the London banking firm of McCalmont Brothers and Company, which was one of the early investors in the Reading Railroad and by far the largest stockholder. There we go, like the shadowy British capital lurking. The right to own coal mines could not be acquired by the obvious method of asking for an amendment to the Reading's charter, for too much public protest might be aroused if the plan became generally known. A safer way was to obtain a charter for a corporation with some innocuous name, which would be phrased so that the Reading could acquire the corporation. Gowen claimed that such charters, quote, were as plenty as blackberries in August, and that he could have had his choice of them, but for reasons best known to himself, he preferred to get his own charter through the legislature. In January 1871, he persuaded a friendly senator, that is State Senator Mumma, Joseph Mumma, who has one of the funniest names of, there's like very little information, I think, about State Senator Joseph Mumma out here. But he is a character straight out of Gustavus Myers. Is it George Mumma, perhaps? Wow, there's a later Mumma in the Republican Party that ran in the Colorado, in 2024. He ran as a Republican in Colorado, and he lost in a close election. So what is Mumma? Like, is that an English or Welsh name or something?
I have known some people with Welsh names that were like quite weird. I remember there was a girl in my high school with the last name Wang who was Welsh, and it was very very unusual name. Someone's like, I don't know. Welsh is an unusual language. Sometimes I look at these Welsh words and I don't know how to pronounce them at all. So that could be the case.
I found the answer. It's actually German. I guess it makes sense for Pennsylvania. But it's like an old German... It's believed to be an altered form of an unidentified German surname. Granted, the Google AI, sorry. But no, houseofnames.com says it comes from Friesland, now a district of Lower Saxony. It might be sort of like a modification or like an anglicization of like Mumme, like Mumme, but nonetheless, Senator Mumma, I guess, coming from, I guess some Mummas have been in the United States since like the 1700s, so that's mystery finally solved. But anyways, he gets his friend Senator Mumma to introduce this bill. So, he gets him to introduce an act in the Assembly, an act incorporating the Franklin Coal Company, empowering it to own and operate coal mines wherever it might choose. This innocent-looking measure contained not a single reference to the Reading Railroad, but tucked snugly away in Section 7 was the sly clause, quote, it shall be lawful, ... for any railroad or mining company existing under the laws of this state, i.e. the Reading, to subscribe for or purchase the stock or to purchase or guarantee the bonds of the company hereby incorporated. Proceeding along the usual routine paths, the bill came up before the Senate on February 14th. Unmoved by the Valentine spirit, an indomitable foe of monopoly, Senator Esaias Billingfeld of Lancaster County rose to his feet to attack the sleeper clause in the bill. I had to say here, critical support for Senator Esaias Billingfeld. He's probably, maybe he has some positions that are awful, but he does come through in this story as like one of the only politicians that is extremely vigilant and like hates corporations and foils Gowen like several times. So in the resulting debate that Billingfeld started, someone asked what company was backing the measure. Its sponsor, Senator Mumma, first said only that it was handed to him, quote, by a friend who is engaged in the anthracite coal business in the county of Schuylkill, then admitted that the friend was Gowen. He added a limping explanation that Gowen was interested in the bill only as a trustee of the Girard estate and not as president of the Reading. Unconvinced, the Senate struck out the objectionable clause by a one-vote margin, making the bill useless to the Reading. Yeah, that was actually right when he was like about to unveil his fucking like 200% freight increase. So like, if they hadn't passed it that day, it probably wouldn't have gotten passed anyways. But then he brought it back under a different disguise a couple months later, the very day the legislative committee ended its investigation of him, March 28th. The new measure was introduced in the House by a member from the Washington and Beaver County district, far removed from the anthracite region. The proposed corporation this time had the title of the Laurel Run Improvement Company, the Laurel Canyon Improvement Company. The bill gave no hint of what Laurel Run was to be improved, but implied that the improvement was to come from mining coal and iron. The disguise allowed the bill to slip through the House undetected, although Richard Williams of Luzerne, who was also a member of the WBA, complained that, quote, here was a bill that took in the island of Black Susan and San Domingo, and not a word was said against it. I don't know. Then he says something racist. Anyways, the author, uses a metaphor that is racist now. Yeah, when Senator Mumma bumbled, quote, this is not exactly a bill allowing the Reading Railroad to become the owners of coal lands and mine them as such, Senator Brooke of Delaware County declared, there's nothing else in it. With the mask thrown off, Gowen's forces jumped into the fray. They easily overwhelmed amendments which would have prevented the Laurel Run Company from operating in Schuylkill and Luzerne counties, only to go down to a 17-15 defeat when Senator Billingfelt again moved to strike out the clause, enabling the Reading to take over the charter. Once more, apparently, Gowen had been beaten, but this time he was not occupied with business in New York. The Senate adjourned for lunch, and he had an opportunity to work a miracle of conversion. One can only speculate as to how that miracle was worked. Later, when Gowen had made new enemies, some of them flung charges of bribery at him. To these accusations, he replied, quote, since I have been the president of the Reading Railroad Company, that company has never employed unfair or dishonorable means to obtain the passage through the legislature of any act securing to it, or any company whatever, any privileges or franchises whatever. Although Gowen frequently adapted the truth to suit his purposes, he was never caught in an outright lie. Well, I disagree with that. It is probable, therefore, that no money was handed out to influence votes in the Laurel Run bill. In any case, Gowen's voice was more persuasive than gold. Whatever may have been served at lunch that day, when the Senate reconvened, 3 of the bill's opponents were conveniently absent and another had changed his mind. On a motion to reconsider the morning vote, Senator Esaias Billingfelt fought a valiant delaying action, but his cause was lost, and the vital section went back into the bill. When the measure came up for final passage the next day, the Lancaster senator, with the vision of his prophetic namesake, spoke out once more. And this is Billingfelt. If we grant the privileges asked for in this bill, before the expiration of a few years, these corporations will monopolize the whole coal trade, and every consumer will be at the mercy of this railroad company. It is not only the privilege conferred in this bill, allowing railroad companies to become operators, that makes the bill so obnoxious, but the idea that we cannot stand up here to defend the rights of the people against the unjust demands of corporations without being surrounded by men employed and sent here to urge the passage of bills of this kind. Gowen's work had been done too well for Billingfelt's impassioned plea to be of any avail, and the measure passed by a comfortable margin. There was still another obstacle to be overcome, for Governor Geary was opposed to the bill. He proved as open to persuasion as the senators, however, and succumbed to Gowen's argument that every other anthracite railroad had the right which it was proposed to grant the Reading. Damn. He actually notes here that's funny. It is an interesting commentary on the journalism of the 1870s that the Capitol Hill reporters dozed through all these proceedings. The Harrisburg State Journal, one of Gowen's critics, reported vaguely a debate over an act to incorporate the, quote, Laurel Run Railroad Company, and only after the bill had passed woke up to the fact that the Reading was involved. The Harrisburg correspondent of the Pottsville Miners Journal, Bannon's paper, must have dallied in a barroom after lunch, for he reported that Senator Billingfelt's amendment had passed without mentioning that the vote had been reconsidered in the afternoon. The Miners Journal itself, usually well informed on Gowen's plans, admitted that it knew nothing about the Laurel Run bill until it had been enacted into law. It should be remembered, on the other hand, that there was little criticism of Gowen's secretive course until several years later, when his enemies began to look for weapons with which to attack him. Yep, so the Laurel Run Improvement Company is created, and then through this shell company, which I think eventually becomes the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, right? It goes mask off, right? After he gets it established. And by the end of 1871, it drops its pseudonym and title. Yeah, so he starts basically buying undeveloped lands, established collieries, iron ore properties, everything, and basically all the stock of this like shell company is owned by the Reading Railroad. So then once he does this, he just starts gobbling up all the land pretty much in like Schuylkill County to just have like a straight up like complete monopoly. But still at this point, we're actually in a very sleepy period going into 1872 and 1873. Pretty sleepy period as far as Molly violence goes. However, the WBA is growing at this time, right?
Yeah. The thing that, like, really, the Mollies basically probably would have just, it seems like the consensus is that they probably would have just, like, passed into complete irrelevance and everyone would have forgotten about them. And at this point, they were basically reduced to just, like, occasional acts of, like, industrial sabotage, basically.
Right.
Or, like, they would beat someone up, like, to intimidate them, like, on election day or something.
Yeah. Or threaten somebody who had blacklisted some, an Irish laborer or miner from a site or something
every
like
now
that.
and again. It like, significantly died down from its heyday. For whatever reason, like their acts of like those like small acts of sabotage in particular, like were like the Reading took notice of them, and they found like the idea of the Mollies convenient. I would say that's basically my read on it. Yeah, I like
exactly because it wasn't the Irish that were resorting to Molly Maguireism in a certain type of way around the time of like 1873. It was Franklin Gowen that was resorting in a way to like Molly Maguire in terms of invoking the spirit of Molly Maguireism to brand his opposition. Maybe it's good to jump to Sons of Molly Maguire right now because he kind of gets quickly to the.
Yeah, this part on the rise of King Cole, it talks about like all the stuff that we were just talking about.
That was the section I'm looking at. Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, like he even says the long sad story of the anthracite labor troubles of the 1870s has been exhaustively documented elsewhere, which you talked about, and it will receive only brief treatment here for the denouement involved many individuals and incidents from the Civil War era. When Gowen took control of the Reading Railroad, he quickly learned the key to profits was the uninterrupted shipment of coal. This lesson was underlined in April 1870 when the company's rail cars rattled to a halt after the Anthracite Board of Trade locked out the mine workers at the Schuylkill field to force the union to accept a pay cut. Gowen brokered a compromise, a one-year agreement that was quickly accepted by the union for the workers of the northern fields in Luzerne and Lackawanna counties had stayed on the job, thereby undermining the strike. Early the next year, the union won some minor gains and a new contract that was quickly ratified. It seemed for a moment that the industry had achieved a degree of stability, at least in the Schuylkill field. That, of course, was an illusion. The trouble began in the northern field, where workers had stayed on the job for high pay during the 1870 strike, then been hit with a drastic wage cut just after Gowen's compromise had ended the southern strike. On January 10th, 1871, the northern WBA quit the pits in an attempt to win back what was lost, and they appealed to the southern miners to join them. Siney opposed the move, but was voted down by militants who saw an opportunity to at last end a debilitating regional rift and create an effective industry-wide organization. It very nearly worked. Within a month, many coal operators were ready to accede to the union's demands, but they had not counted on Gowen. The railroad president, angered by what he viewed as the union's betrayal, raised his freight rates 100%, yeah, we talked about this, making it impossible for any mine operator who had settled with the union to resume shipping. The action spurred widespread outrage, and hearings on the issue were held in March by the Pennsylvania State Senate. We talked about all this, so I'll just skip this part. To achieve a monopoly, Gowen had to overcome several obstacles. His railroad state charter had barred it from mining operations, so the legislature would have to be finessed. The independent mine operators who still dominated the southern coal field would then have to be either bought out or brought to heel. And last, but by no means least, he would have to crush not only the new mine workers union, but also the Hibernian Order, that long-standing locus of labor militancy among the Irish. It talks about how he finagled the legislature and all those things, but basically to achieve, his goal of crushing the Workingmen's Benevolent Association and the Ancient Order of the Hibernians. He
and the independent he first crushes basically the independent operators like in the period leading up to this, which leaves him with his final sort of obstacles, the WBA, right?
Exactly.
And then he realizes he must destroy them.
Yeah, and to do that, he called the Pinkertons.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So yeah, in October 1873, which is also around the time that it's kind of crazy. Like, this is also coinciding with the onset of like a major financial depression and financial panic, right? In 1873. So, which actually starts in, Samuel Morse would feel vindicated. It starts in Vienna, but then spreads through, much of the world and certainly to the United States. And the post-Civil War boom comes crashing down in a haze of like financial chaos, over speculation, et cetera, et cetera. I'm trying to think, was it in August 1873 September? That's when, so actually a month after the economy starts like spinning into a crisis, even though that's not like the primary motivation for Gowen to make his move, but it perhaps kind of spurred on things, made things a little more urgent.
Yeah.
Right. He calls on Alan Pinkerton to come to Philadelphia and meet with him, and that's where the PSYOP book that Alan Pinkerton wrote in 1878 like opens with their fateful meeting, and it's like it's not even the preface to the like 1970s edition I got like stresses that like most of this book is lies, like we actually shouldn't take it literally, like Alan Pinkerton was doing kind of like he was myth making and all this
he
kind
was
of
doing
stuff.
Marketing basically. He was basically like at that time, like one of those people who's like, I don't know, like rescuers, like the people who that movie was basically. That book is the equivalent of that movie that was like a QAnon hit. What was it called?
Like Sound of Freedom?
Yes, exactly. The book is basically the equivalent of Sound of Freedom in terms of its relationship to reality. It's like propaganda for some weird like paramilitary, like para-police organization.
Right. It's got a kind of First Blood Part 2. Yeah. For the propaganda for a police organization. Pretty much. Like this is propaganda of the highest
it's literally
degree.
propaganda, except the only difference is that they're not really cops. They're like a private detective organization that has even less accountability to anyone.
Actually, like in a technical sense, like their activities will involve framing actual cops that for murders they didn't commit and executing them for their political activities. So it opens with Franklin Gowen, and maybe I'll just read what Franklin Gowen allegedly tells Alan Pinkerton,
that's
according to this book.
Yes.
Like, take this with a heavy grain of salt, but this is like how the myth really gets kicked off. So Alan Pinkerton writes, Chapter 1, an extraordinary proposition. Early in the month of October 1873, I was in Philadelphia, and one day received a note from Mr. F.B. Gowen, president of the Reading Railway Company, etc., saying he desired to see me at his place of business. I immediately responded to the invitation, accompanied by Superintendent Benjamin Franklin, and met the gentleman at his private apartment in the company's elegant building on 4th Street. I have sent for you, Mr. Pinkerton, said the president of the two great Pennsylvania corporations, after we had exchanged greetings upon business of importance. I made known my willingness to hear what it was. And this is where Franklin Gowen apparently just launches into this. Quote, the coal regions are infested by a most desperate class of men, banded together for the worst purposes, called by some the Buckshots, by others the Molly Maguires, and they are making sad havoc with the country. It is a secret organization, has its meetings in hidden and out-of-the-way places, and its members, I have been convinced ever since my residence in Pottsville and my connection with the criminal courts as district attorney in the county of Schuylkill, are guilty of a majority of all the murders and other deeds of outrage which, for many years, have been committed in the neighborhood. I wish you to investigate this mysterious order, to find out its interior workings, expose its evil transactions, and see if the just laws of the state cannot be made effective in bringing criminals to justice. At present, whenever an assassination is consummated, and as a consequence, a trial is instituted, a convenient alibi steps forward and secures for the prisoner his freedom. Municipal laws are thus incapable of execution. Sheriffs of counties are powerless, and the usual run of detectives are of as little value as the open uniformed police of the different cities. All of these have been tested, and all have failed. Now, if you cannot disperse the murderous crew or give us grounds upon which to base prosecutions, then I shall believe that it will never be effected. I considered the proposition for a moment, turning over in my mind the magnitude of the labor to be performed. Let me think of it a little, I answered, and in the meantime, tell me more about the Molly Maguires. And again, Franklin. As far as we can learn, the society is of foreign birth, a noxious weed which has been transplanted from its native soil, that of Ireland, to the United States, sometime within the last 20 years. It lived and prospered in the old country considerably earlier. Its supporters there were known as ribbon men, the white boys, and sometimes as Molly Maguires. But their modes of procedure were the same as now pursued in the coal regions. Men were then, as they are at this time, killed, sometimes in broad daylight, sometimes at night, and invariably by strangers, persons at least unknown to chance spectators, or to the parties violently put out of the way. Suspected individuals would be apprehended, but in the end nobody could be found able to identify the criminals. It was only after a protracted struggle in Ireland that the proper evidence could be elicited to convict the tools doing the bloody behests of the society. I suppose it will not be easy to do this in Pennsylvania. The same minds, the same combinations, are to be encountered here. The Mollies rule our people with a rod of iron. They do this and make no sign. The voice of the fraternity is unheard, but the work is performed. Even the political sentiments of the Commonwealth are molded by them, and in their particular field they elect or defeat whomsoever they please. They control, in a measure...
Okay, this is... Well, I don't know. He really starts going off here.
They control, in a measure, the finances of the state. Their chiefs direct affairs this way and that way, without hindrance. Men without an iota of moral principle, they dictate the principles of otherwise honorable parties. In its ultimate results, this complexion of affairs in Pennsylvania touches, to a considerable degree, the interests of the citizens of the whole country. Wherever anthracite is employed is also felt the vice-like grip of this midnight, dark lantern, murderous-minded fraternity. Wherever in the United States iron is wrought, from Maine to Georgia, from ocean to ocean, wherever hard coal is used for fuel, there the Molly Maguire leaves his slimy trail and wields with deadly effect his two powerful levers, secrecy, combination.
Which is also like a euphemism for organizing unions. So yeah.
Men having their capital locked up in the coal beds are as obedient puppets in his hands. Oh no. They have for some time felt that they were fast losing sway over that which by right should be their own to command. They think, with some show of reason, their money would have profited them as much had it been thrown to the fishes in the sea or devoted to the devouring flames.
Wow, this is like Save Palestine from Hamas. Yeah, this is literally like...
Others, wishing to engage in mining operations and who are possessed of the capital and experience necessary, are driven away. They cannot entrust their hard-earned property to a venture which will be at the beck and call of a fierce and sanguinary rabble and its heedless and reckless directors. They wisely turn aside and seek other and less hazardous uses for their talents and their means. The entire population of this state feel the shock, and it is in due season communicated to the most distant parts in which anthracite is used and ore is reduced or smelted.
And Pinkerton says,
I had heard of many assassinations by these Molly Maguires, and also about those performed by the Ku Klux, and other similar political combinations in the southern states. It had always seemed to me that it was a sacred duty which Pennsylvania owed to herself, to her own citizens, and to the country at large, to clear her garments of the taint resting upon them, and to bring to punishment the persons who, for so many years, habitually outraged decency, spilt human blood without stint, and converted the richest section of one of the most wealthy and refined of all the sisterhood of states into a very Golgotha, a locality from which law-abiding men and women might soon be forced to flee, as soon as from the threatened cities of the plain, or from a spot stricken with plague and pestilence. Quote, I will enter upon the business, but it will require time, sharp work, and plenty of both.
So Gowen says, then this is Gowen's work order of what he wants.
Yes, we duly appreciate this. What we want, and everybody wants, is to get within this apparently impenetrable ring, Turn to the light the hidden side of this dark and cruel body, to probe to its core this festering sore upon the body politic, which is rapidly gnawing into the vitals and sapping the life of the community. Crime must be punishable in the mountains of Pennsylvania, as it is in the agricultural counties and in all well-regulated countries. We want to work our minds in peace, to run our passenger and freight trains without fear of the sudden loss of life and property through the malicious acts of the Molly Maguires. We want people to sleep unthreatened, unmolested in their beds, undisturbed by horrid dreams of midnight prowlers and cowardly assassins. We want the laboring men, of whatever creeds or nationalities, protected in their right to work to secure sustenance for their wives and little ones, unawed by outside influences. I'm getting real Vivek vibes now. We want the miner to go forth cheerfully to the slope or the shaft for labor in the breast or in the gangway, for wherever it may seem to him for the best, void of the fear in his heart when he parts from his wife at the cottage gate in the morning, that it may be their last farewell on earth, and by evening his bullet-riddled corpse may be taken back to his home, the only evidence that he has encountered the murderer, the agent of those who would compel him to refuse all employment unless the regulations of the order were complied with. The state cannot attain these things. She has repeatedly tried, and tried in vain. You can do it. I have seen you tested on other occasions and other matters, and know your ability to conduct the business. The business. We are willing to supply everything within our power to make your task a success. Right.
Yeah,
Wow.
this really is like, this also sounds like something that could have like written by like Sheriff Joe Arpaio or something.
I know.
It's like,
this is like Mike Flynn, like
yeah, exactly.
fantasy
Like, you are the
fiction or
greatest person ever. And like, we need you to hunt MS-13. Like, they're so evil and everyone is incredibly oppressed by them.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Like, I feel like there's a
yeah.
million, like, this is like an age-old American tradition of novel. Like, it is, or
Yeah,
I guess it's
like
not.
a Brad Thor intro, you know.
Yeah,
like
I guess
Jack
it's not
Reacher, we
marketed
need
as
you.
a novel. It's like a true story of police work and detective.
Right,
work.
right. Well, speaking
Yeah.
of the detective, then they started. He basically starts. Pinkerton describes what he needs. He needs a true detective. And this is how he describes that. He says to Gowen, I believe it can be accomplished, but I'm also aware it's a stupendous undertaking. I accept the responsibility, however, with its accompanying consequences, which I perceive will prove no small burden to bear. I also see I shall encounter no little difficulty in detailing from the many able and trustworthy men in my force one perfectly qualified for this very unusual charge, and an error in the outset would bring irreparable disaster before the end could be reached. It is no ordinary man that I need in this matter. He must be an Irishman and a Catholic, as only this class of persons can find admission to the Molly Maguires. My detective should become, to all intents and purposes, one of the order, and continue so while he remains in the case before us. He should be hardy, tough, and capable of laboring, in season and out of season, to accomplish, unknown to those about him, a single absorbing object. In the meanwhile, I shall have to exact from you a pledge that whoever I may dispatch upon this errand, he shall not, through you, become known to any person as a detective. This is highly necessary to be strictly attended to. If possible, you should shut your eyes to the fact that I have an employee of my agency working in the mining country. If you can do so consistently, it might as well be given out to everybody interested that the idea of investigating the Mollys through the means of detectives, if ever thought of, has been abandoned as a hopeless job, and that the present status of affairs in the mines is totally incapable of being changed. Take the further precaution that my name and those of my superintendents and employees do not appear upon any of your books. Keep my reports in your own custody, away from all prying eyes. I would also ask, if my agents are engaged for 1 week, for 1 month, or for years, that these requests still be complied with. And further, whatever may be the result of the examination, no person in my employ, unless the circumstances are greatly changed and I demand it, shall ever be required to appear and give testimony upon the witness stand. There it is. And he gives his willing assent to that. So that's what he needs, and that's who. I don't know how we score this, if we actually believe this fucking story about how he stumbles upon James McParlan, but the way he tells it, he's really racking his brains. Like nobody really fits the bill or is perfect for this dangerous job. But then he's riding around on like a city tram one day, I think in Chicago, and he sees one of his employees dressed up as a train conductor who's actually undercover on a Pinkerton job. I'd actually forgotten about this, that he was actually working for Pinkerton in some low-level, like, I don't know, like rail ticket fraud kind of job or something like that. He sees this Irish employee of his, James McParlan, and then, you know, a light bulb goes off in his head, and he goes, oh my God, yes, like this guy. So he grabs this guy. Yeah, he says, one morning I was riding home on 5th Avenue on a West Side streetcar, and I recognized in the person of the conductor an operative previously escaping consideration. James McParlan, the detective alluded to, was born in the province of Ulster, County Armagh, parish of Mullabrack, Ireland in 1844. He was 29 years old. He'd been a Pinkerton for about a year. He came to America in 1867 and had previously worked in chemical works at Gateshead, County Durham in England, and also in Wallsend. So he's, you know, an Irish laborer with some like English experience, and started out as a clerk at a grocery house on 9th Avenue in New York, then became a salesman for a country dealer in dry goods in like upstate New York. He did not make really a lot of money. He kind of did a few different things and like was not too successful. He went to Buffalo briefly and then went to Chicago. And I don't remember reading somewhere that he tried to like open a liquor store at some point, but it burned down in the Chicago fire. Did we make that up?
I don't know if we made that up. I do remember something vaguely like that, but I don't know if we made it up or if it had any truth to it at all, honestly. It certainly wasn't something that I read.
Yeah, I vaguely
remember
recall reading
that
it,
idea, but yeah.
I vaguely recall reading it, but the idea of him being like an immigrant that kind of had like a tough time and was really scraping to like get, you know, opportunity. That's kind of accurate. So the Pinkerton zeroes in on McParlan for whatever reason, and when he kind of described this job, he like immediately takes it and is like, fuck yeah. But he's like, this is going to be very dangerous. He makes up a story that McParlan's like being sent to England to look after like counterfeiters or something. Like they don't even tell anybody at the office where McParlan is going. And then they buy him like a shitty like outfit and put him on a train to Philadelphia. And, this is October 1873, the start of basically like the COINTELPRO infiltration of the Irish. I won't even say the Molly Maguires at this point, but certainly like the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the Irish Catholic power structures in Schuylkill County.
Yeah, and just to like be clear, like a lot of this was just to like zoom out from like Alan Pinkerton's highly biased, highly fanciful interpretation of these events.
Right.
Like what actually like kind of kicked this off was that there like was the burning of a coal breaker, and an empty rail car was dispatched down the track, and that was like the sort of sabotage actions that Pinkerton was initially trying to investigate. Actually, before he like turned to McParlan, he did send 2 detectives down. According to kind of Molly Maguire. Yeah.
Hello, my fellow miners. Like, what happened here? Do you know who did it? Like kind of much more obvious shit. And then they didn't really get a lot of information, and then decided like, oh, we need to send somebody like in to like infiltrate them intimately, right?
Yeah, and right. But it seems like they kind of like took the fact that like people weren't really forthcoming with information about the Mollies, like evidence of guilt and like a conspiracy, when it's also entirely possible that they were just like, they are not really active around here so much anymore. And like they were actually telling the truth. Yeah.
Right. I think they quoted that from in the beginning. The SM and WRH, who are the code names of the detectives. One was told by a resident when they went up to Glen Carbon that most of the Mollies had moved on. Among those who had remained were Jim Brennan, Jim Whitmore, and, quote, McCluskey. The Mollies were still active in politics. A coal operator, Martin Brennan, confided to SM that he had just been badly beaten by a Molly, Jim Burns, quote, because he did not vote the same as Burns. but not everyone was so forthcoming. The detectives talked with carpenters who were building a wooden chute to help quench the fire on the slope, but, quote, they seemed to be afraid to express any opinion as to the origin of the fire. They queried a fireman at the nearby Taylorsville Colliery about who had sent empty rail cars down the track, but couldn't get any satisfactory answers. So, yeah, Pinkerton quickly realized that another type of detective, one who could blend in a little better, was needed. The ideal candidate would be a Catholic native of the Ulster borderlands with an intimate knowledge of the region's violent peasant secret societies. Pinkerton just happened to have such a man in his employ in Chicago, James McParlan. McParlan actually does seem to have, like, known quite a bit about these, like, societies and, like, ribbon men and, you know, like, white boyism, things like that, right?
Yeah, that was kind of interesting that he, like, wrote, like, a 7-page, like, white paper, basically, about the Molly Maguires for Alan Pinkerton, like, on request.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I mean, it's just like breaking down that Pinkerton opening for a second. That, like, now it's sinking into me. Just like, okay, did Franklin Gowen really know all that? Like, he spits out like a Wikipedia article about, like, the Molly Maguires from the beginning, like, presumably before, you know, James McParlan kind of, like, you know, fills in with any kind of knowledge. Like Franklin Gowen comes off in this book as if he just, like, he knows everything about them, and also knows that they're, like, a vast international conspiracy that controls everything down to Georgia. Like, anywhere there's a mine, like it's like, okay, like, it just, none of it rings true. It's all this, like, wacky fucking construction. But I guess it's plausible that McParlan did know some things about these groups.
Well, also, I think that it's probably true that, like, Pinkerton is filling in some details that he might have understood later into what Gowen said, like, in their meeting. But I think it also is possible that Gowen, like, because most of that is just, like, tropes of, like, anti-Irish sentiment that, like, an anti-Irish paranoia that were circulating at the time. You know, the idea,
during the Civil
like,
War, when he lived in Pottsville and was like the DA, and, like,
exactly,
he's familiar with, like, the some of the cultural goings on in Schuylkill County.
You don't have to be, like, super creative to make up, like, a secret society that controls everything, especially, like, a Catholic one that's, like, subverting our country and, like, controls everyone. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, it's not the most, you know, in, like, original thing. Like, but yeah, McParlan had, like, it's true, like, those details, like the ribbon men and stuff like that, you know, that type of stuff maybe came from McParlan, because it seems like he was knowledgeable about it.
Yeah.
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah.
And, like, what the author of Sons of Molly Maguire points out, Bulick, I think, he, like, says that, like, you know, a key element of McParlan's white paper dossier about the Mollies was that he linked the phenomenon to the famine, which, you know, was not the kind of sociological depth that was maybe coming from Gowen or from other people commenting on this issue.
Definitely not. He did seem to have a pretty good grasp and understanding sort of like what motivated a lot of these people in this type of violence. He also says that, I guess, like, he found some, like, a speech from the parish priest where, like, basically McParlan grew up in County Armagh, Reverend Thomas Handley, I think, where he fulminated about, like, assassins and secret societies and, like, condemned them as, like, the absolute worst, like, thing ever. So McParlan perhaps might have been influenced by that kind of being, like, repulsed by secret society violence, maybe, even though he was, you know, fully Catholic. Anyways, let's see. So, you know, he might have been one of these Irish that kind of, like, went with the Catholic Church's stance on Molly Maguireism. That it was, like, very evil, you're excommunicated.
That's kind of what seemed to be the case. Like, Bulick says, talking about this, the ideal candidate for investigating the Mollies would be a Catholic native of the Ulster borderlands with an intimate knowledge of the region's violent peasant secret societies. Pinkerton just happened to have such a man in his employ in Chicago, James McParlan, who was born in 1844 in the parish of Mulgrach, just north of Market Hill in County Armagh. It was the very spot, oddly enough, where the precursors of the Protestant Peepo Day Boys had planned their depredations against the local Catholics in the barn of the widow McParlan in the 1780s, leading to the formation of the Defenders. There does not seem to be any doubt, however, that McParlan's family was Catholic, and in the Black Famine year of 1847, his parish priest fulminated about the causes of the disaster then sweeping the land. Reverend Thomas Hanley cited worldliness, inactivity, Sabbath breaking, and neglect of church ordinances, before coming to what he considered the worst. Murder, that most treacherous and damnable of crimes. Treacherous, for the assassin walks abroad wearing the daylight robe of charity and peace, salutes you, by the way, engages in conversation, watches his opportunity, plies his secret dagger, effects his deadly purpose, then flies back to his hiding place, glutted but marked with blood. Damnable, for if there is one more than another, who, should he die unrepenting and unforgiven, shall suffer the extreme of hell's torment and hell's punishment, it will be the assassin who, unprovoked and with cool and calculating premeditation, waylays his fellow man and sends the innocent victim to an unmerited and untimely grave. And McParlan apparently had the exact same sentiments as that guy. He was appalled by secret society violence.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Though it's funny, he joins like the ultimate secret society, the Pinkertons, which, I mean, in a way, they kind of are. They're like the Protestant state reaction to, privatized corporate reaction to.
I'm starting to remember the hooks, like for our show, that we would be, pitching to people that he was like he was undercover, like within an organization that also had to kind of conceal itself. So there's like layers of deception,
I mean, even like the
trying
logo,
to make McParlan interesting and not just like a piece of shit,
we really tried to, do what we could, but unfortunately, the ambient pressures of propaganda, you just have to, I don't know. So he starts off, they send him off on his undercover mission, and he takes the train up to Schuylkill County, and Sons of Molly Maguire says, it was an oddly quiet time in the hard coal fields. With the Union taking up miners' grievances, the Hibernians had stood down from their role as avengers. The Mollys had not killed anyone since December 1871, when Morgan Powell, a Welsh mine boss in Summit Hill, Carbon County, had been gunned down. In Schuylkill County, there had only been one murder since Barney Dolan took over as county delegate of the AOH in 1868. That of Patrick Burns, a Tuscarora mine boss who was killed in April 1870. McParlan's real work began in November when he toured the west end of the county as a tramp, stopping in Swatara, a mining village on the edge of the West Branch region that had been the site of much trouble during the Civil War. Finding no signs of Molly Maguire activity, he doubled back toward Pottsville, taking refuge from a snowstorm in a Minersville tavern and sharing a conversation with Hugh Mohan, who was the state secretary of the Emerald Beneficial Organization, a rival to the AOH. That conversation aroused some suspicion when McParlan returned to Pottsville and stopped in the Sheridan House, a Center Street saloon run by the former county commissioner and reputed Molly leader Pat Dormer, a gray-haired veteran of the Hibernians. Yeah, Pat Dormer is like a dude who's really went back to the Civil War period and like before. Like, he's been in the mix for a long time, this saloon owner. So McParlan impressed Dormer by dancing a jig, singing the Molly Maguire ballad, and winning a barroom brawl. This is basically dramatizing like the opening of like the movie, basically.
Yeah.
They kind of he wins by the Chaitin at cards. I think that might have happened with Muff Lawler, but you're Chaitin. Yeah, I think that's how it's relayed by Alan Pinkerton.
I wrote a couple pretty good versions. I don't think there is one in the current draft. Like, I feel like that was something that I was still we were still trying to figure out. But I feel like I wrote a couple of good versions of the jig scene.
The jig scene was pretty good. Yeah, that was a pretty wild jig scene. Yeah. So, he does all the things you have to do. Oh, yeah, but there was a guy there. One of the colorful figures in this, who I guess was hanging out at Sheridan House, was Daniel Kelly, a.k.a. Manus Cole, a.k.a. Kelly the Bum, who had his doubts, according to Alan Pinkerton, who recorded the following conversation in his book. Quote, "Didn't I see you at Minersville not long ago, in company with Hugh Mahan?" McParlan says, "Sure, and may you did. You might as well as not." He kind of writes in like phonetic Irish.
Yeah.
At least, for I war with him at that place only the last month sometime. Kelly scanned the face of the detective sharply for a second and then resumed. "Do you chance to belong to the Emeralds? The benevolent society of that name is what I mean. No, I do not. Well, I know Mahan to be a member. and he's been making himself very free with lashings of people hereabouts within the last few weeks, inviting them to join, and I didn't know that you were one. With any doubts about his membership in a non-violent Irish Benevolent Society laid to rest, McParlan went on to further ingratiate himself with Dormer. In January 1874, he made an even better contact when Dormer introduced him to Muff Lawler, the Shenandoah bodymaster, mine contractor, and former Glen Carbon resident. When the conversation turned to reports that the Reading planned to import 5,000 workers to break the Union, Lawler showed he could bluster with the best of them. Quote, "You must know that I am a man of learning, and some sound sense and know the workings of this region," the bodymaster boasted. "And if President Gowen undertakes to do this, in place of requiring the state militia to protect those new men in the mines and protect his breakers, shafts, and depots from the torch, he will require them all to protect his own life." No, it's a direct death threat. Anyways, going on. McParlan's reaction must have impressed Lawler. He told the detective that if times were not so hard, he would hire him. In fact, Lawler did something much better, taking the newcomer under his wing and inducting him into the Shenandoah Lodge of the Ancient Order of Hibernians on April 15, 1874. With a ready supply of cash to keep his hard-drinking buddies, buddies. One of my favorite words that I don't think most Americans realize this, and maybe I'm a little bit off with it, but I have to assume that the vernacular word buddy, is an Irish term that, by so many of the sources from the 19th century, Gowen does this, a bunch of other people do it, they always refer to it in quotes with, derision, Mr. Kehoe and his butties, with
exactly.
2 T's.
Yeah.
It's so funny, but they really did use it. That really must have been an Irish word, and maybe particular to the coal mining region of you gotta have, you gotta stick by your buddies, and so basically, he's
it was an older dialect term meaning workmate associated with coal mining. Buddy.
Yeah. So that's another contribution. The American lexicon right there. Yeah, so let's see, where was I? Buddies. Oh yeah, he, with a steady supply of cash to keep his hard-drinking buddies in booze, McParlan steadily rose in their esteem. At one point early on, he was introduced by a Pottsville publican as, quote, one of the old school, a sure sign of respect in an organization that was itself a throwback. Much has been written about accusations that McParlan served as an agent provocateur during his years undercover. Regardless of what he did or did not do to prevent specific acts of bloodshed, a few points are certain. The first is that Molly assassinations had been reduced to little more than a memory at the time McParlan joined the Hibernians. The second is that within months of his induction, longtime Hibernian leaders who had kept a lid on violence were removed, a process in which the detective played at least some small part. The third is they were replaced by men more willing to spill blood. On April 17th, 2 days after McParlan became a Hibernian, the Miners' Journal dismissed as, quote, totally without foundation reports of a murderous secret organization of miners. Quote, there might have at one day existed a society known as the Molly Maguires, the object of which was revenge for fancied wrongs to any of its members, the paper opined, but whether it is kept up now is more than we can say. A Molly Maguire ballad about McParlan recorded in the 1930s struck much the same note. Quote, he came among these people at a very quiet time and bragged himself to be a plotter in a most atrocious crime. He sure did. He sure
Good
did.
one. Yeah.
So one factor in the decline in violence was the leadership of West Branch veterans like Barney Dolan, the county delegate, and Muff Lawler, the Shenandoah bodymaster, who did their best to rein in a rambunctious rank and file. And it mentions earlier, actually, that Muff Lawler, there's a fateful kerfuffle that occurred where a Welsh miner named Gomer James, who is going to pop up in this McParlan saga, killed an Irish miner. I think, was this in 1871 maybe? And this is in another town. Muff Lawler was asked to kill Gomer James, but then he sort of backed off and didn't do the Molly hit, basically. And I think as a result, his political standing in the AOH suffered as a result. But I guess from Muff Lawler's perspective, he was trying to tamp down on revenge killings and things of that nature. So it says here, in addition to stalling the revenge killing of Gomer James, Lawler prevented another wild goose lodge when he sidetracked a plan to burn down a mine patch where 2 Mollys had been beaten and then shoot its inhabitants as they fled the blaze. As the New York Times put it, quote, Barney Dolan was a man who sought to rule rather by quote, moral suasion than by brute force. But Lawler and Dolan were ousted soon after McParlan joined the order. Alan Pinkerton went to some pains in the Molly Maguires and the detectives to refute the notion that McParlan acted as an agent provocateur, but a close reading of his account suggests that if nothing else, the detective was an agent of change. While he may not have deliberately provoked violence, his efforts to gain a better perch within the organization to do his spying seem to have had a domino effect that contributed to the violence. There are perils in trying to sort out the internal politics of a secret society well over a century after the fact, but Pinkerton's account suggests that the key to the situation lay in McParlan's friendship with Frank McAndrew, an illiterate native of County Mayo, who wanted to succeed Lawler as Shenandoah bodymaster. Lawler at first appeared reluctant to induct McParlan into the Hibernians, fearing another vote for his rival, but then McParlan promised to help Lawler get an even better position, county delegate. When the detective promised, quote, to do his utmost to put Lawler in Dolan's position, the former chuckled with satisfaction and promised to make McParlan a member at the very next meeting. McParlan was as good as his word. When in July, Dolan had Lawler ousted for refusing to avenge the Cosgrove killing, with Gomer James, etc., McParlan helped McAndrew become bodymaster. All this turbulence proved highly advantageous to McParlan. Because McAndrew could not read or write, the detective was appointed secretary of the lodge at a July 15th meeting, a move that gave him cover to gather information, write it down, and move around. Right, I remember that he was elected as the secretary, and that's very deft that he got an illiterate guy like put in the position of being the head so that he could like just basically take notes and like spy on them openly. Yeah. I guess they claim he was sending almost like daily reports, which was a very like secretive and dangerous thing, obviously, especially to do that for about like 2 years. But anyways, he gets himself in to the Shenandoah, AOH group here. And he's kind of like doing little like COINTELPRO shit, like talking shit, like causing little dramas between people. It says, when the secretary of the Pennsylvania AOH visited the bar of Tom Fisher, the Carbon County Hibernian leader, McParlan put in a bad word about Dolan. McParlan agreed with others that Dolan should be banned from the organization for life for cursing a bishop. Dolan was indeed expelled on August 31st, and in a telling passage, Pinkerton notes that while Dolan was stunned by the decision, it came as no surprise to the detective. But Lawler's hopes to replace Dolan had been dashed, and Jack Kehoe, the Girardville bodymaster, was named county leader in his stead. So Jack Kehoe would, go on to be kind of the public enemy number one for Franklin Gowen, eventually. And I think, like we said, portrayed by Sean Connery in the film.
The 1970 film.
In the 1970 film, Yeah, and actually pardoned in the 1970s by the governor of Pennsylvania.
After he saw the movie,
after he saw the movie, exactly. No, he has been absolved now, but he certainly was not absolved in this story, and one of actually probably the most unfairly prosecuted individuals in this. But anyways, so he rises to the top of the AOH leadership in Schuylkill County. He's also, I forget at this point if I think he's been elected town constable of Girardville and is also a tavern owner on top of that. So a real community leader. Yeah, so this sort of, this entire period, like we said, not a very violent era particularly. There's no murders in the several year period. But then, of course, it changes. So going on, at least one contemporary Schuylkill County observer believed the violence that marked Kehoe's reign as county delegate was part of a strategy by the new county delegate to establish a contrast with his predecessor, who was Dolan. Quote, Kehoe, acting on the assumption that Dolan had been cowardly and weak in his direction of the order, endeavored to contrast with such former policy his own boldness and daring, Francis DeWeese wrote in 1877, while Kehoe was still alive. McParlan made note of all the changes in the AOH, sending regular reports to Pinkerton, who forwarded summaries to Gowen. And the Ulsterman wasn't the only Pinkerton spy in the anthracite region. There were several others, P.M. Cummings, William McCowan, and one identified only as RJL. I'm pretty sure that's RJ Linden, right?
Yeah, probably.
I think so. I don't know why he doesn't name him in this book, but I'm pretty sure it's RJ Linden. Monitoring the WBA. While the violence of the Mollies was at this point a little more than barroom bluster, there was plenty of activity to report on the labor front. So, in October 1873, just as Pinkerton was dispatching spies into the anthracite field, Siney, the head of the Anthracite Mine Workers Union, was organizing a national convention of mine workers in Youngstown, Ohio. A nationwide miners' union was born at the convention with Siney as its president. He promptly resigned as leader of the WBA in a move that helped spark acrimony between the new organization, the Miners' National Association, and the WBA, which was often referred to as the State Union. And he notes that many of the old combatants were moving on. Benjamin Bannon sold the Miners' Journal to his old acolyte, Robert H. Ramsey, that same year. So I guess by then the owner-operators had been crushed, so his dream is dead. Yeah, so then, I'd forgotten about this too, that John Siney leaves Schuylkill County just as James McParlan arrives. And he goes on to build this, to try to build this national union. And then John Welsh gets elected in April 1874 to replace Siney. And he's another, kind of represents maybe sort of the shifting identity currents of, the Irish community there, because he's a Civil War veteran, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think at that point you start to see kind of that issue from the Civil War era kind of start to fade, and also because their most fierce enemies at this point in the labor struggle happen to be represented by Democrats. And of course the Irish are also Democrats, but Franklin Gowen, a hardcore Democrat, Cyrus Pershing, some of these other, not Benjamin Bannon, but yeah, some of these newer kind of threats are all Democrats anyways. So as 1874 came to a close, a titanic battle loomed between coal operators insisting on a deep wage cut and a union determined to protect its gains. There was no bargaining this time. The companies, which had been stockpiling coal, simply announced a wage cut of 10 to 20%. The union's position was weakened when the mine workers of the northern field accepted the pay cut. Once again, the out of sync with Scranton. On January 5th, his back to the wall, Welsh formally announced a strike. It was clear that if the WBA lost, it would be shattered. So this is the long strike of 1875 that then commences. It all kind of comes to a huge showdown. And this goes on, I think, for 5 months through a long, cold winter. And the union, held firm in what came to be known as the long strike. Mockery was used to stiffen the spines of anyone considering a return to work. In late May, the Pinkerton operative, R.J. Linden, reported that, quote, 2 rough-looking men had entered the bar at the Ashland Hotel. Quote, they were said to be miners, distributing snide poetry and ballads, but their real purpose being to sound the men and prevent them from going to work. When mockery didn't work, there were other means available. McParlan reported on May 10, 1875, that three Shenandoah area Mollies had, quote, proposed to call a meeting of the few of the Molly Maguires of No. 3 and Lost Creek and to destroy those men who were to work at the West Shenandoah Colliery and also to destroy their homes. Hibernians had been Union enforcers since the Civil War, but with the advent of the WBA, they were acting without sanction. That is not to say a few rank-and-file Union members did not appreciate their efforts. Quote, some miners who do not live up to the rules of the state union are very much afraid of the Molly Maguires, a detective reported in May 1874, referring to the WBA. Others who are favorable to the state union also favor the Molly Maguires, saying that many a man joins the state union for fear of the Molly Maguires. Even Welsh, the WBA leader who helped redirect the West Branch from its bloody course, saw some value in the Molly's fearsome reputation. In a speech to Shenandoah strikers reported by McParlan, the union leader, quote, referred to some of the newspapers branding all the miners as Molly Maguires, and said this was all the better, as it would keep black sheep away. Interesting. So yeah, the union and leading Hibernians tried to apply political pressure, joining in an anti-monopoly convention in Harrisburg on March 4th that sought to unite independent coal operators and miners in opposition to Reading Coal and Iron. Among those attending were Lawler and Hugh Mohan of Minersville, who was named secretary of the proceedings. But it was all for naught. Snide songs could not fill the bellies of children weak with hunger. Barroom plots did not budge the Reading, and political pressure failed to faze Gowen. He was starving the strikers into submission. Hundreds of families rose in the morning to breakfast on a crust of bread and glass of water, who did not know where a bite of dinner was to come from, one historian wrote. Day after day, men, women, and children went to the adjoining woods to dig roots and pick up herbs to keep body and soul together. The Union did not die quietly when bands of strikers, headed by a drum corps with flags flying, descended on Mahanoy City on June 3rd to free some imprisoned comrades and shut down mines. A spectacular burst of violence ensued, and the Mollys were in the vanguard. Philip Francis, a Welsh Union member who took part in the march, described the scene in a memoir. First, we marched to the jail to get some miners out who were in jail for being too rough in the city. The police and 18 citizens were there, all armed to defend it. It was then and there that I first saw Jack Kehoe, a leading Molly, with his pistol in hand, arguing with the police at the jail door. Sometimes they would place their pistols at each other's breast. According to Francis, a gun battle was avoided only after a magistrate agreed to bail for the Union men. Damn. As the strikers left the jail with their freed comrades, they headed toward the Little Drift mine, intent on shutting it down. They were confronted by a deputy sheriff, who read them the Riot Act, backed up by the Mahanoy City Police and a civilian posse. When an overexcited deputy, whom Pinkerton identified as Tim Jolly, fired into the crowd, mayhem ensued. Both sides began shooting, and those strikers who were not armed tossed rocks and manhandled any policemen and posse members they could get their hands on. Among the most prominent combatants on the Union side were Kehoe's brother-in-law, James Friday O'Donnell, of Wigan's Patch, who, quote, did some rapid shooting, and Friday's housemate, James McAllister, whose brother was married to O'Donnell's sister. McAllister received a cut in the head while throwing rocks at the officers, according to Pinkerton. Among the casualties on the law enforcement side were two members of a newly formed state militia unit, the Silliman Guard, which had close connections to the town's law enforcement apparatus. William Enke, a magistrate, posse member, and private in the militia unit, was injured in the head by a rock, while Henry Leitenberger, a policeman and fellow guardsman, was gravely wounded by a gunshot, but not before he cut down several strikers. The Francis memoir tells how, after the crowd picked up a man he identified as Ellison and passed him over their heads, it next turned its attention to Leitenberger. Quote, I could see Leitenberger's eyes and his firm chin. He backed away about 20 feet, placed both elbows to his side, and began shooting rapidly. There was no need to aim. We stood so close together. Every shot found its mark. After every shot, we could hear cries of, ow, ow. Damn. In addition to Enke and Leitenberger, several other men with close ties to the Silliman Guard appear to have played prominent roles in the law enforcement side that day. The man Francis identified as, quote, Ellison was most likely the Mahanoy City Police Chief, Elias Whetstone, who was the father of a Silliman Guardsman, John Whetstone. Henry Lockman, a policeman who was wounded in the leg, was the next-door neighbor of another guardsman, Henry Simmer. Finally, the trigger-happy Tim Jolly, who Pinkerton said started the riot by firing into the crowd, was almost certainly another member of the Silliman Guard, Jim Jolly. Oh my God, wow. So they false flagged. Wow. No one named Tim Jolly appears in the 1870 or 1880 census for Mahanoy City. When it was all over, the Union men, acting much like a labor militia, quote, formed in line and marched defiantly through town, headed by music. The bloody riot marked the death knell of the strike, but the Kehoe clan's clash with members of the Silliman Guards would come back to haunt the Anthracite region before the close of the year. Welsh announced a formal end of the strike on June 14, 1875, citing, quote, the keen pangs of hunger. Joe Patterson, the Secretary of the Union, recalled the bitterness of the defeat. Famine drove the men into submission. It was a terrible thing to submit to a 20% reduction. Evil days had come. We went to work, but with iron in our souls. Benjamin Bannon, who had always hated unions, lived to witness the demise of this latest one, but just barely. He died on July 29, 1875, at age 68, just as the last wave of Molly violence was getting underway. Yeah, well, that's more or less how the first big mining labor union was shattered, by just starving out everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now the Workingmen's Benevolent Association is dead, and it is at this point where Molly Maguire violence finally does return at last, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the final wave, and it does return. I mean, people start dropping, but crucially also, you know, on both sides of the conflict, people start dropping, because I think it's only fair to point out that the Molly Maguires were not the only ones engaging in vigilantism by this point, right? You know, we just mentioned the Silliman Guard, but of course there was also undercover Pinkertons, the Coal and Iron Police, kind of running around in various like citizens vigilance committees that were becoming more active, and arguably maybe even like some of the Welsh gangs like the Modocs and the Sheet Iron Gang, etc. So just read a little more here about now the final wave of violence that does grip with McParlan just firmly embedded. I forget which book describes it. It might have been the Anthony Bimbo one that's like a socialist history of it or something. But there was one that like described during the long strike when there was this big clash of like miners and militia people that McParlan was like running at the head of like a pack with like 2 pistols and like just this crazy like mustache. Just like McParlan, it should be stressed, McParlan sort of developed a reputation as being like one of the, like honestly crazy Tom Mosher. Right, like crazy
exactly.
Tom O'Mosher.
It's exactly that type of situation.
Like, yeah, where we need to fucking do something, man.
Yeah,
I think it's time to fucking act. Like,
yeah. There's a good quote about it in the Sons of Molly Maguire. I don't think that you had read it yet, but yeah, like much has been written about accusations that McParlan served as an agent provocateur during his years undercover. Yeah, you did read it. Yeah.
Which I think, if anything, this book like could go be a little more emphatic, that like I get that's a responsible historian thing that you can't really know for sure, but at the same time
I mean it's pretty no, I think that he's pretty explicit that it's you know, it speaks for itself,
and he has some very good evidence also of the complicity of, you know, the violence on the other side and how complicit like certain people in the town were for it, and like we're totally not punished. So yeah, let me read this part just about this period of acute Molly violence that explodes after the Union is crushed and the strike ends. So with the Union broken, many mine bosses retaliated against those who had been in the forefront of the labor struggle, which meant that many Irishmen found themselves blacklisted. The choices were simple and hideously familiar for those who had fled the Irish famine 30 years before: migrate, fight, or starve. John Welsh, for one, had to move to western Pennsylvania for a time to find work. There were plenty of others in the same situation, and for those who could not or would not move, fighting seemed a better option than starving. As a result, Molly violence returned with a vengeance. In the 7 years between the founding and destruction of the regional union, the Molly Maguires have been involved in 4 murders. In a 2-month period after the long strike ended, Molly gunmen killed 6 individuals, most of them mine bosses or law enforcement officials. Benjamin Yost, a Tamaqua policeman, was gunned down on July 5th. A month later, on August 4th, the Mollys killed Thomas Gwyther, a Gerardville justice of the peace, and finally closed accounts with Gomer James, the killer of Cosgrove. And parenthetically, the James killing would, in short order, decimate the leadership of the organization, for a dispute about who should get the blood money for the murder had to be decided by a panel of bodymasters, all of whom were later convicted as accessories after the fact. On September 1st, Thomas Sanger, a Cornish mine boss, and his friend William Uren, a miner, were killed, and on September 3rd, it was the turn of John P. Jones, a Welsh mine superintendent in Lansford, Carbon County. McParlan had seen it all coming. Quote, this is McParlan, "Now you can see yourself how this is, and what I predicted at the time of the suspension, that if the Union would fail, there would be rough times," he wrote on September 2nd. "Under the Union, quote, each man got his turn," he said, "but now the Irish are discharged. Or if not, they are put to work at some place where they can make nothing, and there was very little killing whilst the Union stood, but now it is quite the reverse." So, you know, even Sus McParlan acknowledges that, you know, despite, you know, Gowen's cosmology about the Union and the Mollys being one, it was the success of the Union that suppressed violence, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's a classic thing of like it's mediating the class struggle in a less violent way. But then if you crush the union, you create a power vacuum, and these people have no recourse to stand up for themselves. So, of course, some of them are going to turn back, right, to their old ways. So,
especially when prompted to do so by
McParlan,
and a violent gang has been basically organized by a spy who has infiltrated the community. So
pretty much, yeah. That's also exactly. Let's see. So McParlan's report as an undercover detective for the corporation responsible for the situation was simply a more articulate version of the letter from a Mahanoy City Molly published in the Shenandoah Herald 1 month later. Quote, "I am against shooting as much as ye are," the letter read, "but the Union is broke up, and we have got nothing to defend ourselves with but our revolvers, and if we don't use them, we shall have to work for 50 cents a day. I have told ye the mind of the children of the mistress Molly Maguire. All we want is a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, and that's what we can't get now by a long shot." So, yeah, that's straight from the children of the mistress Molly Maguire. But yeah, it's actually quite clear, of why they're doing what they're doing. So the struggle was waged with ballots as well as bullets. Kehoe, the Schuylkill County AOH leader and the constable of Gerardville, signaled his displeasure with the coal establishment that fall by working to undermine Cyrus Pershing, the Democratic candidate for governor, who just happened to be the senior judge of Schuylkill County Court. That would definitely come back to bite him. Kehoe's work on behalf of the Republican incumbent, John Hartranft, was only modestly effective. He delivered Gerardville in West Mahanoy Township and can hardly be credited with Pershing's defeat. Kehoe's embrace of the governor has been portrayed as a cynical attempt to curry favor with an official who had the power to pardon. Some local officials associated with the Hibernians were facing embezzlement accusations, and 3 Mollies had recently been arrested in the Jones killing, the Tamaqua body master, James Powder Keg Kerrigan, and 2 Mount Laffey men, Edward Kelly and Michael J. Doyle. But if Kehoe was trying to curry favor with powerful officials on behalf of accused Mollies, snubbing the local Democrat who presided over the court that would try them seems an odd course. Rather, it may be that his work on behalf of Hartranft simply demonstrated the degree to which the political alignments of the Civil War era had become irrelevant. With a Democrat like Gowen running the Reading and a Democrat like Pershing running the courts, the conflict was no longer one that pitted Irishmen, Catholics, Democrats, and Union members against Anglo-Saxons, Protestants, Republicans, and mine owners. Now it was simply the coal companies and their allies versus the workers and theirs. Kehoe soon had more immediate worries in the election results. And this is one of the most fucked up incidents, honestly, that happens during this whole thing. On December 10th, this is the Wiggins Patch Massacre. On December 10th at night, vigilantes invaded the home of Kehoe's in-laws, the O'Donnells of Wiggins Patch, between Mahanoy City and Gilberton. Charles O'Donnell never stood a chance. He was dragged outside and shot 15 times. His sister, Ellen McAllister, who was several months pregnant, died of a single bullet wound to the chest. Their mother, Margaret O'Donnell, escaped with a mere pistol whipping. Luckier still were 2 other inhabitants of the house, James Friday O'Donnell and Ellen's husband, James McAllister, who were both at that riot, right? Both got away. It was the sort of attack that was common in Ulster from the 1790s right through to the 1990s. Masked killers armed with pistols and inside information, gunning down victims in their home in the wee hours of the morning. The identity of the attackers was never determined for certain, but the home's occupants had been included in a list of Molly Maguires that the Pinkertons had circulated in the area, and a note found on the scene the next day read, "You are the murderers of Urin and Sanger." Perhaps as important, Friday O'Donnell and James McAllister had been active participants in the June 3rd riot in Mahanoy City that injured several members of the Silliman Guard. The only man ever taken into custody in what became known as the Wiggins Patch Massacre was the militia unit's second-in-command, Frank Wenrich, on the word of Margaret O'Donnell, Kehoe's mother-in-law, but he was quickly released. A Mahanoy City burgess and butcher, Wenrich displayed a curious sign. This is actually sus. Wenrich displayed a curious sign on his Center Street shop in the year of the vigilante killing. It featured a giant eye, flanked by the words, meat market. It was an odd symbol for a butcher, but a near-perfect match for the logo of San Francisco's famed Vigilance Committee and that of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Yeah, we didn't talk about the one-eye symbol of fucking the Pinkerton Agency. They were the first to do it, real trendsetters. Mm-hmm. William Enke, Wenrich's fellow guardsman who was wounded in the June 3rd riot, was a professional sign and coach painter. Was a professional sign and coach painter. So kind of implying that he did it. Interesting. Wenrich also had business dealings with Reading Coal and Iron. Just a couple of weeks after the butcher's arrest in the Wiggins Patch killings, a coal company official who lived just 2 doors away from Wenrich's commanding officer in Mahanoy City wrote a curious note to Reading Coal and Iron's immensely powerful land agent, Frank Carter. Wenrich had, quote, Mahanoy Township orders amounting to about $175. Can you pay them, or don't you want to have anything to do with them? The note from Thomas L. Hess may have been a simple accounting question, but it is worth noting that Wenrich's business was in Mahanoy City, a separate municipality from Mahanoy Township, which included Wiggins Patch. Yeah. That's fucking sus, honestly. Yes. Like, the idea of, like, the butcher being, like, a murderer for, like, right-wing nativist coal company mafia people, and, like, I just watched that movie Prime Cut, that, like, cult movie from the 70s that's about, like, an evil, like, meat kingpin in, the Midwest who, like, grinds his victims into, like, sausage. And everything's like meat coated. I don't know. There's something about butchers. I don't know.
It's very sus that he pointed out that the like eye symbol that he used, like for a butcher shop, which it does make absolutely no sense to be the logo for a butcher. Like an eye. Like that's the last thing that anyone would ever want to eat. Like, you know,
nobody eats eyes. You're right. That is actually so strange.
It's bizarre.
But it's like putting up your little like John Birch shingle or something to like show that you're a patriot. Like,
it's rubbing it in our faces, folks.
He is kind of rubbing it in your faces, folks. Wow. And then like seemingly almost like making an order to like murder like certain Mollys and like kind of like disguising it as, I don't know, like meat shipment, and like also writing meat market on it. Yeah, is like so fucking dark. I don't know. Yep, that's
a giant eye flanked by the words meat market. Like, just imagine like a big eye, just like the Pinkerton eye, and then like a meat on one side and market on the other. Like,
right. It's so fucking sus. Honestly, the next sentence sends chills down my spine. The note also opens a window on a web of interlocking business relationships involving officials of Reading Coal and Iron, the Silliman Guard, and members of Mahanoy City's business elite and judiciary. Oh my God. In addition to Carter's duties as land agent for the coal company, he was a close business associate of E.S. Silliman, the man who bankrolled the Silliman Guards. Carter was secretary of the Mahanoy City Water Company, of which Silliman was president. The two were also founding directors of the First National Bank and part owners of the Mahanoy City Gazette. George Troutman, the lawyer who represented Wenrich in the Wiggins Patch case, was, like Silliman, a director and officer of the Mahanoy City Gas Company. Silliman is treasurer of the Fidelity Building and Loan Association. The commander of the Silliman Guard, the architect and builder John Schoner, was a director also. Another set of ties involves Citizens Fire Company, number 2, also founded by Silliman, et cetera, et cetera. So, and actually, the Schoner, this guy who was the foreman during the Wiggins Patch killings, he got that position after the killing of the company's previous fireman, George Major, the chief burgess of Mahanoy County, who was gunned down during a Halloween night riot with a rival, largely Irish-American fire company, Humane. The killing was blamed on the Molly Maguires, and the Silliman Guard was founded a few months after Major's death. So there really is like an anti-Molly Maguire death squad, basically, that like had really personal beef, and like one of them had been killed in an Irish riot. Yeah, he says if the June 3rd riot gave members of the Silliman Guard a direct personal motive for the attack on the O'Donnell home 6 months later, the web of ties among the town's business elite, civic leaders, and law enforcement officials may explain why no one was ever brought to justice in the case. The Wiggins Patch murders on December 12, 1875, were the very last in a long line that stretched all the way back to the killing of James Bergen in his Cole Castle home, nearly 13 years earlier, close to a winter holiday, though this time, of course, the Mollys were the target. In a sense, Wiggins Patch marked not just a closing, but also a convergence. It was as if the two polar opposites of the parade tradition, the rowdy mummers and the disciplined militiamen, had developed violent, extra-legal adjuncts, mollies and vigilantes, who met in the middle and there did battle in a naked class war. In a weird sort of inversion, the Molly leader Jack Kehoe had marched in Mahanoy City on June 3rd at the head of something akin to a labor militia. 6 months later, a leader of Mahanoy City militia unit stood accused of acting like a Molly assassin at the home of Kehoe's in-laws in Wiggins Patch. The folk justice of the Mollies, it appears, had been matched tit for tat by the vigilantism of the militiamen, flip sides of the same extra-legal coin. Damn, yeah, that is interesting. How, ultimately it was like the sort of nativist militiamen that went Molly at the end and murdered like all of Jack Kehoe's in-laws, like, or attempted to. And I remember reading a little more about his mother-in-law, right, Margaret O'Donnell.
Yeah,
was it? And
she really a character in our script.
She was going to be a character as like kind of like if anybody is like actually Molly Maguire in real life, like in this world, that actually like an elderly matriarch that kind of condones all these things and has a lot of like influence and is like, my dear children, like, my dear little ones. Like it would kind of be her. And then they come for her at the end and like pistol whip her and like kill her daughter and her son and try to wipe out their entire family, and then her son-in-law is, scapegoated as the kingpin of it all. And they were like a big Donegal clan, the O'Donnell. That was the connection with Jack Kehoe, really, when you kind of ask, like, well, most of these Mollies have like kind of Donegal roots. And I forget where Kehoe actually where his family or where he emigrated from, but his wife's family were like a big kind of like sturdy Donegal clan, essentially. So yeah, and I don't know if did Friday O'Donnell ever get caught, or did he just like slip away to the ether? A few of these guys just like remember a few of them slipped away, and then didn't one of them like get caught on a train out in like the West or something, and then they like tried to arrest him, and he was like, Mac will never catch me alive, and like slit his own throat or something like that.
I don't know if he slit his own throat, but
he shot himself or something.
I don't know.
Or went down shooting.
I remember
like
Mac will never catch me alive.
Yeah, Mac will never catch me alive.
Yeah.
No, I mean some of these guys got away, but so then things just started to get worse. Things kind of started to get worse after this last kill. Like the backlash really started coming in big time, and one blow was at Archbishop Wood of Philadelphia, who by the way, we didn't mention last time, he was always on the forefront of being like, Molly's fucking suck, AOH sucks. Like, he's actually English, and he was born in England, was a Protestant who converted to Catholicism. So he's like I'm sorry, no offense to anybody, but like a sus Catholic convert guy. Like, he's like a JD Vance, like, like Adrian Vermeule, like fucking Catholic bishop, which, I mean, it's like fine and like converted to Catholicism is one thing, but like becoming a bishop, but you were like a Protestant, I don't know. And then your whole flock is Irish
tend
people.
to be really into it. I mean, there's a lot of people who have been high up in the Catholic Church, like John Newman, stuff like that. Like a lot of Protestant converts.
That's true.
Like
That's true. Yeah. Didn't like T.S. Eliot
converts tend to be into the religion. I'm kind of like, I'm not going to get into a tangent about American Catholics and how they act and their stupid little infights. So let's continue with this because we only have so much time. It was Tom Hurley who was the guy who you're talking about.
Hurley.
Hurley went to Colorado where he was working as a miner under the name McCabe. He had left Pennsylvania hurriedly after an attempt to kill a saloon keeper named James Ryle and burn his house. Some years later, Sheriff Glares of Gunnison County, Colorado, arrested him for having stabbed a young man named Clines in a fight. He was arrested as McCabe, but on information from the East, the sheriff was able to identify him as Hurley. Taking him aside, the sheriff said, "Your time has come, Tom Hurley. McParlan is on his way here to take you back to Pennsylvania." "Who is McParlan?" demanded Hurley. "You used to know him as James McKenna." No sooner had he heard the name than he slipped his hand under a mattress and, pulling out a razor, cut his throat from ear to ear. As he dropped dead to the floor, he said, "Mac will never get me alive."
Damn.
Wow.
So
he did cut his throat from ear to ear. Wow. Yeah.
Oh my God. That's wild. That's wild. Wild if true. I guess it is. So anyways, let's see. So yeah, they get the Catholic Church once again, like the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, once again like condemns the Molly Maguires and also like excommunicates basically otherwise. He's condemned the Mollys before, but this time he says otherwise the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and basically implies they're the same, and quote unquote excommunicates all of them. But then it says the most alarming development for the Hibernians came in January when Doyle went on trial for the Jones killing, and Powderkeg Kerrigan turned informer. He implicated Alexander Campbell, the AOH treasurer in Storm Hill, in the Jones case, and a host of other Hibernians in the Yost, Sanger, and Urine killings. There was another round of arrests, and rumors began to circulate that an informer had penetrated the order. Suspicion fell on McParlan, and he tried to bluff his way through. But he soon discovered that he was being stalked by a number of Mollys, including Philip Nash, who may well have been the Civil War Labor Committee man in Cass Township. On March 7th, 1876, McParlan came in from the cold, ending one of the most dramatic undercover assignments in American history. With McParlan safe, the arrests picked up. In Cass Township, where it had all begun 14 years before, the Forestville bodymaster went on the run. Frank Keenan, a Queens County native, had been one of the several bodymasters indicted for conspiracy for taking part in the discussions about who should get the reward for the Gomer James killing. A Pinkerton report said that Thomas Mohan, Luke's son, had taken over as bodymaster in Forestville with James O'Leary as secretary. Muff Lawler, embittered by his expulsion for dawdling on avenging Edward Cosgrove, turned informer in the Sanger Urine case, saving his neck and inspiring a derisive ballad, Muff the Squealer. Quotes from it here. Now I'll commence, he says, me whole story to tell. When I go back to Shenandoah, I'll be shot sure as hell. We'll send you to a country where you're not known so well. Be jabers, that's good, says Muff Lawler. I guess. So yeah, Muff Lawler, who was a real one, but then he flipped and he squealed, and it was shameful. So the society was crumbling. In April at a convention in New York, the National AOH expelled all its chapters in Schuylkill, Carbon, Columbia, and Northumberland counties. When Kehoe, the Schuylkill County leader, was rounded up on May 6th with 10 others, the organization was effectively dead. Now came the matter of burials.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty fucked up. This section called the Day of the Rope.
Yeah.
Is let me see if I can find real quick the Franklin Gowen, because I remember reading about this trial for the first time, and it's hard to really, when we talk about judicial corruption or political corruption, it's hard to really wrap your head around just how many layers of fucking
it's
obvious
unbelievable.
corruption.
First of all, Gowen was one of the lead prosecutors.
Yes.
In the trial. That's
personally.
personally.
Which honestly,
basically they were prosecuted and persecuted by the Reading Railroad Coal Company.
That's another thing I kind of can't forgive the movie for not just not seeing this missed opportunity of the historical fact of Franklin Gowen, their nemesis, standing face to face with the Molly Maguires in court, leading the prosecution against, basically monologuing at will, his entire theory about the Molly Maguires, using this fucking spy, this Pinkerton guy, to corroborate, key elements of his story and bury all of these individuals. The conflict of interest there is pretty wild. On top of that, like we mentioned earlier, the presiding judge in this case was Judge Cyrus Pershing, who had just lost a governor race, right, in 1875, one that perhaps incorrectly they literally blamed Jack Kehoe for flipping some of the Irish to vote for Governor Hartranft, the Republican, and contributing to his defeat because they were pissed off about the long strike and everything. So you have a judge that personally fucking hates this group of people presiding. You have the head of the Reading Railroad, lead prosecutor. Then, of course, probably not a huge shocker, you have a jury selection that I think is a lot of German immigrants and stuff like that. No Irish people on the jury, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no Irish people whatsoever, no Irish Catholics. And then Gowen, this is kind of this is sort of the zenith of his career in a way. is going and presenting this kid this great court case. It's kind of like, what's the movie with like the Scopes monkey trial where Clarence Darrow, Inherit the Wind. It's kind of like this. He thinks, I feel like that's how he thinks he's doing.
Yeah, it's true.
He's giving this like historical courtroom performance that is going to become like part
Clarence
of the American
Darrow,
canon.
Basically, yeah, exactly.
Standing up against the reaction of these evil Irish, like anti-democratic plotters and everything else, but also going to achieve all his business goals by doing this. Like, he's definitely achieving some very hard
golden dancer. Things. Yeah, it's like,
the Inquisition of 10. Let me see. Yeah, I mean, the big moment where I think he gives an extremely dramatic monologue at one point where he almost like dares the Molly Maguires to like, if any man be in this room right now, like take a shot because this is the best chance you're ever going to get of like, it's like basically shoot me down now, like because like this is your last chance. It's like I know you're in the room right now with your itchy trigger fingers and everything, like just totally just like captivating everybody. And this was reported on. This became like a news sensation once the trials actually came about, and I think Gowen kind of ensured that it would be. And so it was being reported in like the New York Times, all of the New York papers and the Philadelphia papers at the time, and it was just like absolutely. Let me see, maybe in his biography. Yeah, there's actually, it goes into a little bit more in the Rule of the Reading that possibly like Kehoe might have tried to like have figured out McKenna was a spy and like tried to have him killed, but he sort of slips away at the very last minute because he saw that people were like following him around and shit. They have like a very tense final meeting where Kehoe apparently seems surprised to like see him because he thought he should be like dead already or something like that. Yeah, so remember in the beginning when Pinkerton was like, I don't want any of my agents to like testify in court unless, like I otherwise respect it, whatever. Yeah, it says like he left since his role as a detective had been so fully revealed, his usefulness in the coal region seemed ended. As it turned out, his usefulness had scarcely begun. When he had undertaken the investigation, he'd been promised that he would never have to testify so that criminals convicted through his efforts would not be moved to reprisals. Now that his mission stood revealed, there was no longer much reason for keeping him off the witness stand. Gowen appealed to Pinkerton to lift the ban on his detective's testimony, so it was Gowen that wanted to do it. Pinkerton left the decision up to the operative, who talked the matter over with the Reading president. Would be another good scene to see. Gowen's charm and persuasiveness went to work on the erstwhile McKenna. When Gowen ceased, McParlan sat silent for a full 5 minutes. Then, putting aside his fears of assassination, he promised to return to the coal region and take the witness stand. To guarantee his operative's safety, Pinkerton assigned 2 officers to act as his bodyguard. This good fortune gave Gowen the opportunity to exploit the full dramatic possibilities of the detective's adventures. Up to now, the trials had been moving along without attracting much attention beyond the immediate vicinity. The trial of Edward Kelly, the second of the Jones murderers, which began late in March, was in fact almost dull, since it virtually duplicated the Doyle testimony. The defense attorneys even failed to cross-examine some of the Commonwealth's witnesses. The only interesting variation was the clever stratagem of Kelly's lawyers in seating beside him a brother who closely resembled him. This succeeded in confusing one of the witnesses into the wrong identification, but had no effect on the outcome, which was a speedy verdict of murder in the first degree. Public attention outside the coal region began to be aroused when the Bethlehem Times on April 5th printed what purported to be Jimmy Kerrigan's confession. Although its scooped rival, the Shenandoah Herald, denounced this document as spurious, the confession probably was based on testimony at the habeas corpus hearings. It was, at any rate, sensational. According to the Times, Kerrigan said of the Hibernians, quote, "That is the order of the Molly Maguires and nothing else. The purpose of the Molly Maguires, or AOH, is to kill people and burn down dwellings. The notion is that it is to protect working men, but really they are all the most hardened villains in the place where they reside. If anyone wants any work done, they inform the headman known as bodymaster or president, and he calls a meeting. 2 or 3 men are usually appointed to do such work." Widely reprinted in the metropolitan newspapers, this, quote, confession awakened interest in the Molly Maguires. In some quarters, it was assumed that all Hibernians were murderous ruffians. The Bethlehem Steel Company, for example, ordered all its employees who were members to withdraw from the society or be dismissed. The Catholic clergy in dioceses which had tolerated the order now began to denounce it. At a conference of Catholic societies in New York City, the AOH was conspicuously uninvited. This conception fitted in with Gowen's plan to convict not only the murderers, but the organization as well. Having obtained McParlan's consent to testify, he was now ready to put the plan into operation at the first trial held in Schuylkill County. This was the indictment of James Carroll, James Rorty, James Boyle, Hugh McGeehan, and Thomas Duffy for the murder of Yost. 4 hours before the defendants were brought in, the Pottsville courthouse was jammed with people who had come to watch the selection of the jury. No details had been left to chance. A full bench of 3 judges presided over the court. Aiding the young DA, George Kirscher, were Frank Hughes, General Albright, and another Pottsville lawyer, Guy E. Farquhar. The second day, Franklin B. Gowen himself appeared to join them. For the defense, there were 3 of the men who had acted at Mock Chunk, Bartholomew, Ryan, and Kalbfuss, with a local Irishman, Martin Lavelle.
Sorry, do you want to come to a stopping point and let's do a part 3?
Yeah, we could do the trials
to
aftermath. We definitely don't. We'll talk about these the travesty of American justice that occurred. I guess we could do a part 3 and then the sort of postscript of everything that happened right after that, because I think it is interesting. It's kind of it's a different section of the story. This is about legal drama and also fighting over.
I feel like in what you just read, there's plenty of natural stopping points.
Right, exactly. There's a lot, but as we've just set it up, the stage of stages, the stage within the stage is now set. Franklin Gowen's production, his dramaturgical enactment of judicial theater is about to begin, where this entire conspiracy theory, and I think we'll have some time next time to riff on maybe parallels to today as the
and also
as our institutions get a little bit
Gowen's future and things like that, and kind of the fallout of some of this stuff that might be good to talk about as well. So we definitely should do another one.
Yeah, there's really good stuff here. Okay, we can jump into that next time, because I think we want to especially do Jack Kehoe some justice for the screw job. A lot of these guys definitely get screwed over, and but Gowen, I mean, his arc is actually is fascinating. I would hate to rush through it, because he eventually, this performance does cost him, I think, in the business sense in the long run. There's a reason why I think John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan didn't go strutting out in public. Perhaps it's a cautionary tale for modern day billionaires who want to make themselves public spectacles 24/7, that they might be able to use that to get what they want for a while, but they run a pretty high risk of overplaying their hand, perhaps, and then maybe themselves becoming a sacrificial lamb for, bigger, quieter forces. But we'll conclude. We'll do a part 3 next time and conclude this saga. All right, I guess we don't have to stay vigilant.
Yeah, we don't have to stay vigilant. We can just stay vigilant at the very end.
Yeah.
Back in my school days, acting the fool days, wanting more than money is 3. And the man said, hey, go and get yourself a piece of the big town. Armored ground forces, riding Trojan horses, never made sense to me. I didn't want to be a part of the great debate on moonshine. Stop, pay the price, they said to me, take this advice, go right. for me.